Crew forces black girl to move seats. Final footage leaves airline in ruins. Ma'am, your options are simple. You can take the seat we are offering you in the main cabin, or you can be escorted off this aircraft by airport security. The choice is yours, but we need an answer now. These words were spoken not to a hijacker, not to a disorderly passenger, but to Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, a brilliant scientist holding a valid first-class ticket for the seat she was already sitting in. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being given an ultimatum that would humiliate her in front of an entire plane. What Brandon Thomas, the lead flight attendant of Monarch Air Flight 447, didn't know was that this wasn't just a seating dispute. It was the beginning of the end for their airline, and it was all being recorded. The cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner fell silent. Passengers who had been mindlessly scrolling through phones or adjusting overhead bins suddenly froze, their attention drawn to the confrontation in the second row of the first-class cabin. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the tension. Others stared openly, already taking sides in a battle they knew nothing about. Brandon stood with his weight shifted to one hip name tag gleaming under the cabin lights, his practiced smile replaced by a look of impatience. His blue uniform was crisp, his authority unquestioned until now. Behind him, two other flight attendants hovered, watching with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. Dr. Gabrielle Wilson hadn't moved. She remained seated, hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but resolute. The contrast was striking, the standing flight attendant looming over the seated passenger power dynamics on full display. Dr. Gabrielle Wilson felt the familiar satisfying click as her seatbelt fastened. The plush leather of seat 3A in the first-class cabin of Monarch Air Flight 447 was a small but significant symbol of her success. This wasn't a luxury she took for granted. The daughter of a teacher and a postal worker from Detroit, every step of her life had been a climb. A PhD in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins, a groundbreaking patent for a synthetic skin graft that was saving the lives of burn victims, and now a keynote speaker invitation to the prestigious West Coast Medical Innovation Summit in Los Angeles. This trip, this seat was earned. She was 34, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer and dark jeans, her braided hair pulled back into an elegant bun. She exuded a quiet confidence, an aura of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She had meticulously booked this specific seat and aisle in the third row 3 months in advance. She liked the easy access and the slight bit of extra privacy it afforded. The pre-departure rituals began. A smiling flight attendant named Heather had already offered her a glass of champagne, which she'd accepted with a warm thank you. She'd stowed her carry-on, which contained the laptop with her presentation, in the overhead bin directly above her seat. Her noise-canceling headphones were resting on the empty seat beside her 3B, and she was reviewing her notes on a tablet. Her presentation on the revolutionary properties of her synthetic skin graft had been refined over weeks. The implications were enormous. A material that reduced rejection rates by 87% cut recovery time in half and could be produced at a fraction of the cost of current alternatives. It meant more lives saved, especially in developing countries where advanced burn treatments were often unavailable. Gabrielle's fingers swiped through slides showing microscopic images of skin cells bonding with the synthetic material. These weren't just clinical successes. They were stories of children who could grow up without disfigurement, of adults who could return to normal lives after devastating accidents. Each slide represented years of meticulous research, late nights in the lab, and the quiet determination that had defined her career. The soft hum of the cabin, the polite murmurs of other passengers, the clinking of glasses. It was a symphony of calm before a 5-hour flight from New York's JFK to LAX. She was engrossed in her slides, visualizing the auditorium, picturing the faces of her peers, when a shadow fell over her tablet screen. She looked up to see a couple in their late 50s, dressed in expensive but tasteless resort wear. The man, tall and red-faced, with a shock of silver hair, was pointing at her boarding pass on his phone, then at her seat. The woman, dripping in gold jewelry with a face pulled taut by cosmetic surgery, had a sour, impatient expression. "Excuse me?" The woman, Victoria Palmer, said, her voice carrying an edge of condescension. "I believe you're in our seats." Gabrielle offered a polite professional smile. "Mistakes happened." "Oh, I don't think so. I'm in 3A. She held up her own boarding pass on her phone, clearly displaying her name, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, and seat 3A. The man, Richard Palmer, scoffed, not even bothering to look at her screen. "Our passes say 3A and 3B. Victoria likes the aisle." He gestured impatiently at Gabrielle. "So you'll need to move." There was no hint of confusion, only a blunt command. Gabrielle's smile tightened slightly. "I think there must be a misunderstanding with the airline system. My pass says 3A and I was assigned this seat when I checked in. Perhaps you could speak with the gate agent or the flight attendant." Victoria Palmer let out an exaggerated sigh. "We don't have time for that. The flight is about to board completely. Just move. There must be another open seat you can take." The implication was clear. Her seat, her confirmed and paid-for space, was less important than their convenience. The calm symphony of the cabin had just hit its first discordant note. Richard tapped aggressively at his phone screen. "Look right here. 3A and B." He thrust the phone toward Gabrielle's face close enough that she had to lean back. The screen indeed showed a boarding pass for 3A under the name Richard Palmer. "I see that," Gabrielle said, maintaining her composure. "But I also have a confirmed assignment for this seat." She displayed her own boarding pass again. "This appears to be a duplicate booking issue. The airline will need to resolve it." Victoria's jewelry jangled as she shifted her weight impatiently. "Well, we're Platinum Elite members. We fly Monarch Air 20 times a year. I'm sure they'll resolve it in our favor, so you might as well move now." Several nearby passengers had begun to watch the exchange. A young man across the aisle glanced up from his phone, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the escalating tension. "Status doesn't override confirmed bookings," Gabrielle explained gently. "I'm a frequent flyer as well. Let's just have the flight attendant sort this out." Richard's face flushed deeper red. "Listen, I don't think you understand how this works. When there's a seating issue, it's first come, first served, and—" "Actually, sir," Gabrielle interrupted calmly, "airline policy typically honors the passenger with the earlier booking time in cases of duplicate assignments. I booked this seat 3 months ago." Victoria's eyebrows shot up, disappearing momentarily beneath her blonde bangs. 3 months. Who books that far in advance? That seems excessive. I had an important conference to prepare for. Gabrielle replied, her voice still even. Planning ahead is part of my professional approach. Richard's eyes darted around the cabin, seeking a flight attendant. This is ridiculous. We're holding up the entire boarding process. Heather Bryant approached, her practiced smile firmly in place, but her eyes already assessing the situation with a predisposed conclusion. She was in her late 50s, with a severe blonde bob and a permanently pinched expression, as if she'd just smelled something unpleasant. Is there a problem here? She asked, her gaze flicking from the well-dressed Palmers to Gabrielle and lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Yes, Victoria Palmer said, her voice suddenly taking on a helpless, aggrieved tone. This young woman is in my husband's seat 3A, and she's refusing to move. We just want to sit together. Heather turned to Gabrielle, her professional veneer already cracking. Miss, can I see your boarding pass? Gabrielle, maintaining her composure, showed Heather her phone. As I explained to the couple, my pass clearly says 3A. I booked this seat months ago. Heather glanced at Gabrielle's phone, then at Richard Palmer's. His also said 3A. It was a classic airline overbooking glitch, a simple computer error. In a normal situation, the protocol was clear. Check the booking times, apologize profusely for the system error, and then find a suitable accommodation for the passenger who was booked later, often with a generous travel voucher as compensation. But Heather didn't check any booking times. She didn't consult a manifest. She made a calculation based on a lifetime of ingrained biases. She saw the Palmers, wealthy, white, and complaining loudly. She saw Gabrielle, a black woman, sitting alone, quietly holding her ground. In Heather's mind, the path of least resistance was clear. "Well," Heather said, turning her full attention to Gabrielle and completely ignoring the Palmers, "it seems there's been a duplication. This happens sometimes." Her tone was dismissive, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "Mr. and Mrs. Palmer are traveling together and they need these 2 seats." Gabrielle's eyebrows rose. "I understand they want these seats. I have this seat. This is my confirmed assignment. The error, while unfortunate, is the airline's to resolve. It does not obligate me to give up my seat." She was a scientist. She dealt in facts and logic. The facts were on her side. Heather's thin smile vanished. "Miss, we're trying to get this flight out on time. It would be much simpler for everyone if you would just cooperate. We have a very nice seat for you in row 12. "Row 12, Gabrielle repeated incredulously. "Not even an economy plus a middle seat in the main cabin." The demotion was as swift as it was insulting. "I'm not moving to row 12. I paid for a first-class ticket and I reserved this specific first-class seat. I am not voluntarily downgrading because of a mistake your airline made." Across the aisle, a young man named Marco Rodriguez, a tech vlogger who filmed his travel experiences, discreetly angled his phone on his lap. He'd seen the Palmers' entitlement and Heather's immediate deference. Something about the quiet, unyielding dignity of the woman in 3A made him sense this was a moment that needed to be documented. He pressed record. Richard Palmer, seeing he had the flight attendant on his side, decided to assert his dominance. "Listen," he said, looking down at Gabrielle, "we've spent over $50,000 on Monarch Air flights this year alone. We're not just passengers, we're investors in this company's success." He gestured to his wife. "Victoria has a bad back. She needs the aisle seat for this 5-hour flight, and I need to sit next to her to help her if she needs anything." Victoria quickly adapted to this narrative, placing a hand dramatically on her lower back. "Yes, my condition requires frequent movement. It's actually a medical necessity." Heather nodded sympathetically. "You see, miss, this is why we need to make this accommodation." Gabrielle looked from Heather to Victoria to Richard, her expression unchanged. "If Mrs. Palmer has a documented medical need, I'm sure the airline has a record of it and would have assigned appropriate seating in advance. I sympathize with her condition, but that doesn't negate my confirmed booking." This wasn't the first time Gabrielle Wilson had faced this particular brand of dismissal. As the only black woman in her graduate program at Johns Hopkins, she'd endured countless moments of casual erasure professors addressing questions to her white male lab partners, administrators asking if she was in the right building, peers expressing surprise at her test scores. There was the conference in Boston where she'd been mistaken for housekeeping despite wearing a presenter badge. The hospital rounds where patients had asked to speak to the real doctor. The funding committee that had questioned whether her research was too ambitious for her level of experience only to approve similar grants for less qualified colleagues. Each time she'd swallowed the insult, smiled politely, and worked twice as hard to prove her worth. Each time she'd told herself that success would be the best revenge, that changing the system required working within it. Each time a small piece of her dignity had been chipped away, until the day her mother, Eleanor Wilson, had been hospitalized with pneumonia. Gabrielle had flown home immediately, rushing to Detroit General, still wearing her lab coat. She'd found her mother's room and discovered her lying alone, unattended, despite pressing the call button repeatedly for pain medication. "They don't see me, baby," Eleanor had whispered, her breathing labored. "They look right through me like I'm not even here." Something had shifted in Gabrielle that day. Standing beside her mother, a woman who had spent 30 years teaching in Detroit's toughest schools, who had never missed a parent-teacher conference or a bill payment, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's education, she'd made a promise. "I see you, Mom," she'd said, gripping Eleanor's hand. "And I promise you I will never again let anyone pretend I'm invisible. Not for convenience, not for comfort, not for anything." Now sitting in seat 3A with 3 pairs of expectant eyes on her, Gabrielle remembered that promise. She thought about the thousands of dollars she'd paid for this ticket, about the countless times she'd moved, accommodated, apologized for taking up space. About how, in this moment, the Palmers and Heather Bryant weren't seeing Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, award-winning biomedical engineer. They were seeing an inconvenience, an obstacle, someone who should gratefully accept less than what she'd paid for. And she decided not today. Not in seat 3A. Not ever again. "I need to be clear," Gabrielle said, her voice controlled but firm. "I am not moving from this seat. I have a valid ticket I booked months in advance, and this is where I will be sitting for this flight." Richard Palmer's face darkened. "Do you know who I am? I'm on a first-name basis with 3 Monarch Air vice presidents. One phone call from me, and Sir Gabrielle interrupted. Who you know is irrelevant to the fact that I have a confirmed seat assignment." Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that managed to carry to nearby rows. "This is what's wrong with people these days. No respect for status, no understanding of hierarchy." By now other passengers were openly watching. Some looked uncomfortable, others annoyed at the delay. A few were glancing between Gabrielle and the Palmers with expressions of concern. Heather's smile had completely disappeared. "Miss Dr. Wilson." Gabrielle corrected her calmly. "My boarding pass and ID both say doctor." "Gabrielle Wilson. I've earned that title." Heather blinked momentarily, thrown off script. "Dr. Wilson, then. The fact remains that we need to resolve this situation quickly. The Palmers are valued customers, and as am I," Gabrielle stated. "I fly Monarch Air regularly for conferences. Not at our level. Clearly," Victoria muttered loud enough for several rows to hear. "Platinum Elite means something." A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Edward Reynolds. We're currently showing a slight delay in our departure time due to a seating issue. We appreciate your patience as our crew resolves this matter." The announcement drew collective sighs and murmurs from the cabin. A businessman 3 rows back called out, "Come on, just sort it out and let's go." Heather glanced nervously at her watch. "Dr. Wilson, please. We can offer you a voucher for a future flight if you'll just cooperate." "I don't want a voucher," Gabrielle replied. "I want the seat I paid for, the one that's assigned to me." Richard leaned toward Heather, speaking in a voice just quiet enough that he thought only she could hear. "This is ridiculous. Just get security and have her removed." Marco Rodriguez, still recording discreetly from across the aisle, adjusted his angle to capture more of the interaction. His travel vlog had never ventured into social justice territory before, but his instincts told him this moment mattered. A young flight attendant approached Lisa Kennedy, 23, her uniform still stiff with newness, her trainee badge visible. She hovered at the edge of the confrontation, watching Heather with a mixture of deference and discomfort. "Is there something I can help with?" Lisa asked tentatively. "No," Heather replied sharply. "I have this under control. Go check if everyone in rows 10 through 15 has boarded." Lisa hesitated, her eyes meeting Gabrielle's briefly before she nodded and retreated. Victoria Palmer had pulled out her phone and was typing furiously. "I'm messaging Thomas Wilkins right now. He's the customer service director for the entire East Coast division." "By all means," Gabrielle said. "Perhaps he can explain why your booking from 2 weeks ago is being prioritized over my booking from 3 months ago." Victoria's fingers froze over her screen. "How do you know when we booked?" Gabrielle held up her phone. "My confirmation email is dated July 15th. Your husband just showed me your boarding pass, which has a confirmation code starting with OC. Monarch Air's October bookings all start with OC." Richard's face flushed deeper. "You don't know what you're talking about. That's not how the codes work." "Actually, it is," came a voice from behind them. A middle-aged man in glasses, Nathan Cohen, a professor at Columbia, had stood up from his seat in row 4. "I fly Monarch Air almost weekly. She's right about the confirmation codes. They change monthly." Lead flight attendant Michael Bennett strode purposefully up the aisle, his senior rank evident in both his uniform insignia and the confidence of his gait. Tall, with graying temples and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, he carried the air of someone used to resolving situations through authority rather than understanding. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, directing his question to Heather rather than to any of the involved passengers. Heather quickly briefed him, her account noticeably skewed. "The Palmers are Platinum Elite members with confirmed seats in 3A and B, but this passenger is refusing to relocate. We've offered her a seat in Economy Plus and a voucher." Michael nodded, absorbing this framing of the situation without question. He turned to Gabrielle, his demeanor professional but cold. "Dr. Wilson, I understand there's been some confusion with the seating assignments. In these situations, we need to consider multiple factors, including our loyalty program tiers. There's no confusion about my assignment," Gabrielle replied evenly. "I have a confirmed booking for this specific seat that predates the Palmers by months. The confusion appears to be on Monarch Air's end, not mine." Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nevertheless, we need to find a workable solution for all parties. The Palmers are traveling together and I'm traveling alone, so my comfort matters less." Gabrielle asked, her tone still measured but pointed. Victoria Palmer interjected. "It's not about comfort, it's about necessity. As I've explained, I have medical needs." Michael seized on this. "Medical accommodations do take priority, Dr. Wilson. If Mrs. Palmer requires specific seating for health reasons, then that should have been arranged in advance." Gabrielle completed his sentence. "If this is a documented medical need, Monarch Air would have noted it in their system and assigned appropriate seating from the start. This appears to be a post hoc justification." Michael's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing annoyance. "I don't appreciate the implication that we're not taking appropriate measures for all our passengers." By now, a security officer had appeared at the front of the cabin, Diego Martinez, 35, in the dark blue uniform of airport security. He stood quietly assessing the situation, his presence alone an implicit escalation. Gabrielle noticed him immediately. "Is security really necessary for a seating misassignment?" Michael didn't answer directly. Instead, he lowered his voice and leaned closer to Gabrielle. "Dr. Wilson, I'm trying to find an amicable resolution here. The Palmers are longtime customers with our airline and we value their loyalty. Surely you can understand the position we're in." "I understand perfectly," Gabrielle replied. "You're choosing to honor status over fairness, convenience over contract. My position remains unchanged. I have a valid ticket for this seat and I will not voluntarily give it up." Richard Palmer stepped closer, invading the small bubble of space around Gabrielle's seat. "This is outrageous. We've been standing here for 15 minutes because of her stubbornness." "Sir, please step back," Gabrielle said firmly. "You're in my personal space." Michael placed a hand lightly on Richard's shoulder, guiding him back slightly before turning again to Gabrielle. "Dr. Wilson, as a compromise, we can offer you a seat in our Economy Plus section, a $300 travel voucher, and priority boarding on your return flight. This seems like a reasonable accommodation." The offer hung in the air, its subtext clear to everyone within earshot. "We expect you to take less than what you paid for, so that these more valuable customers can have what they want." Gabrielle looked Michael directly in the eyes. "No." The simplicity of her refusal seemed to catch him off guard. Around them, the cabin had grown increasingly tense. Other passengers were whispering to each other, some filming discreetly with their phones. The standoff had become a spectacle, a public test of wills. Michael's jaw tightened. "Dr. Wilson, I need to make something clear. As the lead flight attendant, I have the authority to make seating determinations for the safety and comfort of all passengers. If you continue to refuse to cooperate, we may need to take more serious measures. Are you threatening to remove me from this flight for sitting in my assigned seat?" Gabrielle asked, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the cabin. "I'm informing you of potential consequences," Michael replied, his words carefully chosen. At that moment, Security Officer Martinez stepped forward, his presence alone, an intimidation tactic. The airline staff had formed a physical semicircle around Gabrielle's seat, Michael, Heather, and now Martinez, creating a wall of authority meant to overwhelm and isolate. Across the aisle, Marco Rodriguez continued recording his technology background, giving him the foresight to activate his phone's backup battery pack. This wasn't just a quick viral moment. This was turning into something that required documentation. His lens captured the body language of everyone involved. Michael's authoritative stance, the Palmers' entitled impatience, and most importantly, Gabrielle's composed dignity in the face of mounting pressure. His live stream had started with just his regular followers, but comments were pouring in now, the viewer count climbing. "What's happening is these airline employees are trying to force a black woman with a confirmed first-class ticket to give up her seat for this white couple," he narrated quietly into his phone. "She's been nothing but polite and professional, and they've escalated to bringing security." Behind Marco, businesswoman Sophia Thompson, 41, had also begun recording from her first-class seat. Unlike Marco, she wasn't live streaming, she was methodically documenting each interaction, each statement, each escalation with the precision of someone who understood the potential legal implications of what was unfolding. Victoria Palmer, noticing the phones, turned toward Marco. "Stop filming us. This is a private matter." Marco looked up calmly. "This is a public space and I'm documenting what's happening. There's no expectation of privacy in an airplane cabin." "He has every right," Sophia interjected coolly from her seat. "As do I." Victoria turned to see Sophia's phone also pointed in their direction. For a moment, she seemed at a loss, the reality of being documented throwing her off balance. Then she leaned toward Richard and whispered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "These people always think they're entitled to things they haven't earned." The racial undertone was unmistakable. Marco's camera caught it clearly, as did Sophia's. A collective intake of breath rippled through the nearby passengers. The comment had crossed a line, making explicit what had been implicit. Gabrielle's expression didn't change, but her posture straightened almost imperceptibly. She made brief eye contact with Marco, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She was aware of the recording, aware that this moment was being preserved. Michael Bennett, realizing the situation was deteriorating in very public and documented ways, tried to regain control. "Everyone needs to remain calm. Filming is permitted, but please respect the privacy of those around you." "I'm respecting everyone equally," Marco replied. "Just documenting exactly what's happening." Richard Palmer pointed an accusatory finger at Gabrielle. "She's orchestrated this whole thing. Probably called her friends to film this and create some viral incident." "We're the victims here." Sophia Thompson lowered her phone briefly. "Sir, no one here knew each other before boarding this flight. I'm filming because what I'm witnessing appears to be discriminatory treatment." "Discriminatory?" Victoria sputtered. "That's absurd. This has nothing to do with—" She cut herself off, perhaps finally recognizing the dangerous territory she was entering. But the damage was done. The whispered comment, the accusation, the defensive response, all captured and already circulating beyond the confines of Flight 447. Marco's live stream had reached over 500 viewers and was growing exponentially as people shared the link across platforms. Comments were flooding in. "This is exactly what happened to my sister last month on a different airline. They always try to move us to worse seats. Always. Stand your ground, lady. Don't let them bully you." Michael, noticing Marco's ongoing recording, leaned closer to speak quietly to Heather. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded before hurrying toward the front of the cabin. The crew was adapting their strategy, recognizing the public relations risk that was unfolding in real time. Security Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that this was not a security issue, but a customer service dispute that had been inappropriately escalated. His presence alone had transformed a seating disagreement into something that looked to any observer like intimidation. Lisa Kennedy had returned to the scene, tablet in hand. While the confrontation continued, she had quietly used her training access to look up the booking details that no one else had bothered to verify. What she found confirmed exactly what Gabrielle had stated. Her booking timestamp predated the Palmers by nearly 3 months. With nervous determination, the trainee approached Michael and whispered urgently in his ear, "Sir, I checked the system. Dr. Wilson's booking was made on July 15th. The Palmers' booking was made on October 2nd. According to protocol, the earlier booking takes precedence in duplicate assignments." Michael turned to her, his expression hardening. "Lisa, this isn't your concern. Return to your duties in the main cabin." Lisa hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the dismissal of factual information. "But sir, our training manual specifically states that in cases of duplicate seating assignments, the passenger with the earlier booking time has priority unless there are documented medical needs submitted in advance." Lisa, Michael hissed, "Stay in your lane. This situation is being handled." The young flight attendant glanced at Gabrielle, then back at Michael, a moral calculation visibly playing out across her features. In that moment, she made a decision that would later be described as both career suicide and an act of profound professional integrity. Lisa stepped around Michael and addressed Gabrielle directly. "Dr. Wilson, I've checked the booking system. Your reservation for seat 3A was made on July 15th. The Palmers' booking was made on October 2nd. According to Monarch Air policy, your earlier booking takes precedence in this situation." The cabin fell silent. Michael's face flushed with anger. "Lisa, you are out of line. Go to the rear galley immediately." Lisa stood her ground for a moment longer, meeting Gabrielle's eyes with an apologetic look that conveyed both solidarity and regret. Then she nodded and walked toward the rear of the aircraft, her shoulders squared despite the public reprimand. The dynamic had shifted dramatically. A Monarch Air employee had publicly confirmed what Gabrielle had been saying all along. The factual basis of her position was now undeniable, even as the airline staff continued to side with the Palmers. Gabrielle nodded subtly to Lisa's retreating form, a small acknowledgement of her courage. Richard Palmer, sensing the tide turning, changed tactics. "Look, this has gone on long enough. We're all reasonable people. The girl made a mistake checking the system. Our status with the airline clearly gives us priority in seating disputes." The "girl" checked the actual booking information that should have been verified from the start, came a new voice from across the aisle. It belonged to Nathan Cohen, the professor who had earlier confirmed Gabrielle's point about the confirmation codes. "What we're witnessing is textbook discriminatory treatment. The policy is clear, the facts are verified, yet the staff continues to side with one party over another based on criteria that appear selective at best and biased at worst." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The momentum was shifting not through confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of facts, witnesses, and documentation. Michael Bennett's professional demeanor was cracking under the scrutiny. "Professor, with all due respect, you are not familiar with all the factors that go into these decisions." "I'm familiar enough with fairness," Nathan replied. "And with what I'm seeing, I'd be comfortable testifying about it if necessary." The word testifying hung in the air, the first explicit reference to potential legal consequences. Marco's live stream captured the moment, as did Sophia's methodical documentation. Viewers online were commenting by the thousands, now many tagging Monarch Air's official accounts demanding responses. Michael turned back to Gabrielle, his voice lower, almost conciliatory. "Dr. Wilson, perhaps we can revisit our offer. We could upgrade you to our premium first-class section in row 1, which is actually superior to your current seat. Would that be acceptable?" It was the first acknowledgement that Gabrielle might be owed better, not worse than what she had originally booked. But the damage was done. The contrast between the initial offer of a downgrade to economy and this sudden upgrade proposal only highlighted the arbitrary nature of the airline's approach. The cabin intercom crackled to life again. "This is Captain Reynolds speaking. Due to the ongoing seating issue, I'll be coming into the cabin to address the situation personally. We appreciate everyone's continued patience." A ripple of anticipation moved through the passengers. The captain's involvement represented yet another escalation, but also the potential for resolution from a higher authority. Captain Edward Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, his presence commanding immediate attention. In his early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the confident bearing of a former military pilot, he moved with purpose down the aisle toward the site of the confrontation. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone it had over the intercom. "I understand we have a seating discrepancy that needs resolution." Michael quickly briefed the captain, his account notably more balanced than before, acknowledging the verified booking times, but emphasizing the Palmers' loyalty status and Victoria's claimed medical needs. Captain Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Gabrielle. "Dr. Wilson, I understand you've been offered alternative seating but have declined. Could you explain your position to me directly?" The question seemed fair. The captain's demeanor neutral. For a moment it appeared that a reasonable resolution might be at hand. Captain Reynolds Gabrielle began, "I booked this specific seat 3 months ago. I selected it carefully for this flight because I'm presenting at a medical conference tomorrow and needed the comfort and convenience of first class, specifically an aisle seat for easy access. The Palmers have a duplicate booking made more recently, and rather than honor the standard first booked, first served policy, your crew has attempted to move me to a lesser seat, brought in security, and created an intimidating environment." Captain Reynolds listened attentively, then turned to the Palmers. "And your perspective?" Richard straightened, adopting a more professional tone than he had used previously. "Captain, my wife and I are Platinum Elite members who fly Monarch Air exclusively for both business and pleasure. Victoria has a medical condition that requires easy access to the aisle and my assistance during flight. We booked these specific seats for that reason." "Did you request special accommodation when booking?" the captain asked. Victoria hesitated. "Not formally, but our status usually ensures our seating preferences are respected." Captain Reynolds nodded again, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the growing number of passengers recording the interaction, at Michael's tense posture, at Security Officer Martinez's uncomfortable stance, and finally back at Gabrielle, who sat calmly waiting for his decision. "I've heard both perspectives," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do." The cabin held its collective breath. Dr. Wilson will be moved to another seat to accommodate the Palmers. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the cabin. After everything, the verified earlier booking, the trainee's confirmation, the witnesses, the captain was still siding with the Palmers. Gabrielle's composure didn't waver, but her eyes reflected disappointment and resolve. "May I ask the rationale behind this decision, Captain?" "Your own airline policy states that the earlier booking takes precedence." Captain Reynolds' expression hardened slightly. "In my capacity as captain, I have final authority over all matters on this aircraft, including seating arrangements. While policy provides guidelines, safety and operational efficiency are my primary concerns. The Palmers' status with our airline and Mrs. Palmer's medical considerations take priority in this instance. The nakedness of the favoritism was stunning in its brazenness. Despite all evidence, despite public documentation, despite the clear policy, those with privilege were being protected while rules were being selectively enforced. Dr. Wilson, the captain continued his tone, leaving no room for further discussion. You have 2 minutes to gather your belongings and move to the seat being offered, or we will be forced to have you removed from this flight." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and consequential. Marco's live stream viewer count had surpassed 2,000. Comments were flooding in, many expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Captain Reynolds turned to go, apparently considering the matter settled. But before he could take more than a step, Gabrielle's voice stopped him. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her tone respectful but unyielding. "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. I have documentation that I booked this seat months in advance. I have witnessed your employee confirm this fact. I have declined lesser accommodations because I purchased this specific seat, and I have the contractual right to occupy it. If you choose to have me removed from this flight for sitting in my assigned seat, that is your decision, but I want everyone present to understand exactly what is occurring." The cabin had gone completely silent. Every eye was on the standoff between the composed scientist and the airline captain. It was a moment of crystalline clarity where the abstract concepts of fairness, authority, and dignity became startlingly concrete. As Captain Reynolds and the crew awaited her response, Gabrielle faced the most consequential decision of this confrontation. Would she capitulate, accepting less than what she had paid, for less than what she was entitled to, or would she hold her ground, knowing the potential consequences, being removed from the flight, missing her conference presentation, becoming the center of a public incident? In that moment, a memory surfaced with vivid clarity. She was 16 again, sitting in her mother's kitchen in Detroit, while Eleanor Wilson reviewed her college applications. "Baby, you've got to understand something," her mother had said, looking up from the stack of forms. "In this life, there will be people who expect you to be grateful just for being allowed in the room. They'll expect you to accept less to be satisfied with crumbs from the table, to stay quiet when you're wronged." Eleanor's eyes had been fierce with protective love. "But you remember this. Your dignity is not negotiable. Not for convenience, not for comfort, not for anything. The moment you start accepting less than what you're owed is the moment they win." That lesson had carried Gabrielle through years of subtle and not so subtle dismissals, through every space where she'd been made to feel like an interloper rather than a rightful participant. It had guided her response to colleagues who attributed her success to quotas rather than brilliance, to conference organizers who mistook her for support staff, to every instance where someone had expected her to step aside to make herself smaller for their convenience. In the pressurized cabin of Flight 447, surrounded by witnesses both present and virtual, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson made her decision. She reached for her phone and with deliberate calm placed a call on speaker. Jennifer Patterson's office came a crisp, professional voice. "Jennifer, it's Gabrielle Wilson. I'm currently on Monarch Air Flight 447 at JFK, and I need your counsel regarding an ongoing situation." The name Jennifer Patterson meant nothing to most people in the cabin, but Captain Reynolds' subtle shift in posture suggested he recognized it. Jennifer Patterson was one of the most respected aviation attorneys in New York, known for her successful representation of passengers in discrimination cases against airlines. "I'm on speaker," Jennifer asked. "Yes, I'm sitting in my assigned first-class seat 3A, which I booked 3 months ago. The crew is attempting to make me move to accommodate another passenger who booked the same seat more recently. They've escalated to bringing security on board, and the captain has just threatened to have me removed if I don't comply within 2 minutes. Multiple passengers are recording this interaction." There was a brief pause. "Are they claiming any safety rationale for moving you specifically rather than the more recently booked passenger?" "No. They've cited the other passenger's loyalty status and an unverified medical need that wasn't documented during booking." I see Jennifer's voice was measured, professional. "You should know that FAA regulations prohibit discriminatory practices in seating assignments. Monarch Air's own contract of carriage states that in cases of duplicate bookings, the earlier booking takes precedence absent safety concerns. The recordings by other passengers are legal in a public space like an aircraft cabin. Should they remove you from this flight for refusing to give up your properly assigned seat, you would have substantial grounds for both a civil claim and a DOT complaint." Captain Reynolds's jaw tightened visibly. This was no longer just a difficult passenger. This was a passenger who understood her rights and had immediate access to legal representation. "Thank you," Jennifer Gabrielle said. "I'll keep you updated on how this resolves." She ended the call and looked calmly at Captain Reynolds. "I will not be moving. I have a contractual right to this seat, which was assigned to me months before the Palmers' booking. I have declined your alternative offers because they represent a unilateral alteration of our agreement. Any action taken against me for remaining in my rightfully assigned seat will be addressed through appropriate legal channels." Her voice carried clearly, not raised but perfectly audible to everyone nearby, including the now dozens of passengers recording the confrontation. Marco's livestream comment section exploded. She came prepared. The captain's face when he heard aviation attorney. Monarch Air is about to get dragged. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate a single passenger into compliance had transformed into a documented legal liability unfolding in real time before thousands of witnesses. Captain Reynolds exchanged a glance with Michael Bennett, a wordless communication passing between them. With a subtle nod, Reynolds signaled to Security Officer Martinez. Ma'am Martinez began stepping forward. "I'm going to have to ask you to. I'm live streaming this to over 3,000 people right now," Marco announced, clearly holding up his phone. "Everything that happens next will be viewed by thousands, possibly millions." "I'm recording as well," Sophia Thompson added. "As are at least 7 other passengers that I can see." Martinez hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with his role in this escalating situation. This wasn't a security threat. It was a customer service dispute that had been inappropriately escalated to law enforcement. Officer Martinez Gabrielle said calmly, "I want to be clear that I have not violated any law or safety regulation. I am sitting in my assigned seat with a valid ticket. I have not been disruptive in any way. I'm simply declining to give up the seat I paid for and was assigned." Martinez looked to Captain Reynolds, his discomfort evident. "Sir, this appears to be a civil matter between the airline and the passenger. Without a safety risk or violation of law, my authority to intervene is limited." A flicker of frustration crossed Reynolds's face. His attempt to use security as leverage had backfired, with the officer himself questioning the appropriateness of the escalation. In that moment, Richard Palmer lost patience. He reached for Gabrielle's carry-on bag in the overhead bin above her seat. "Since you won't move, we'll move your things," he said, pulling the bag out. Sir Gabrielle's voice sharpened for the first time. "Remove your hand from my property immediately." The cabin erupted in gasps and exclamations. Richard froze the bag half extracted from the bin. "That's theft and assault," someone called from a few rows back. Officer Martinez immediately stepped forward. "Sir, you cannot touch another passenger's belongings. Put the bag back now." Richard's face flushed deep red. Slowly he pushed the bag back into the overhead compartment. The moment was captured clearly on dozens of phones, the entitled aggression immortalized in digital form. Victoria Palmer, seeing the situation deteriorating, attempted damage control. "My husband was just trying to help resolve this situation. We've been standing here for nearly 30 minutes by attempting to remove someone else's property," Nathan Cohen asked incredulously. "That's not helping. That's intimidation." The confrontation had crossed a critical threshold. What had been a verbal dispute had now involved an attempt at physical intimidation. The recordings would show not only the airline's preferential treatment, but also the escalation to near physical confrontation, all directed at a woman whose only offense was sitting in her assigned seat. Captain Reynolds, recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond his control, made a critical decision. He stepped back into the aisle and addressed the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to the ongoing disruption, I regret to inform you that this flight is now delayed indefinitely until we can resolve the current seating issue. I apologize for the inconvenience." The announcement was met with groans and protests from passengers who had been sitting patiently through the extended boarding process. The captain had effectively made Gabrielle responsible for delaying the entire flight, a classic pressure tactic designed to turn public opinion against her. "This is ridiculous," called a businessman from row 7. "We're going to miss our connections because of a seat dispute." "It's not a seat dispute," Marco countered loudly, still recording. "It's about an airline trying to force someone out of the seat she paid for because they double-booked it and are favoring certain customers over others." The cabin divided rapidly, some passengers directing their frustration at Gabrielle for causing the delay, others recognizing and calling out the injustice of the situation. "Just move so we can go," someone shouted from the back. "Why should she move?" "It's her seat," came another voice in response. Captain Reynolds watched the divisions form with a calculated expression. This was precisely the outcome he had anticipated, using the collective pressure of delayed passengers to force Gabrielle's compliance. But as the protests continued, TSA Supervisor Andrea Ramirez appeared at the front of the cabin, summoned by airport operations due to the unusual delay. In her mid-40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and the unmistakable authority of federal credentials, she surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency. "Captain Reynolds," she said, approaching the group at row 3, "we've received reports of an extended boarding disruption. Can you brief me on the situation?" Reynolds explained the seating conflict, noticeably emphasizing the delay to operations while downplaying the discriminatory aspects that had been captured on dozens of recordings. Ramirez listened impassively, then turned to Gabrielle. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" With the same composure she had maintained throughout, Gabrielle displayed her boarding pass on her phone. Ramirez examined it, then asked to see the Palmer's passes as well. After reviewing both, she stepped back and addressed Captain Reynolds. "Captain, this appears to be a duplicate booking issue, not a security matter. TSA has no jurisdiction over seating assignments unless there's a legitimate security threat, which I'm not seeing here. This is a matter for Monarch Air to resolve according to its own policies and the contract of carriage." She turned to Officer Martinez. "Diego, unless there's a safety or security issue I'm not aware of, this doesn't require TSA or airport security presence." Martinez nodded, clearly relieved to be removed from the situation. "That was my assessment as well, Supervisor." The captain's strategy had backfired spectacularly. Not only had security refused to remove Gabrielle, but a TSA supervisor had now publicly identified the dispute as a contractual matter rather than a security issue, implicitly validating Gabrielle's position that she was being asked to give up her rightful seat without legitimate cause. The cabin had fallen silent, all eyes on this new development. Marco's live stream count had surpassed 10,000 viewers. The comments were flying by almost too fast to read, but the sentiment was overwhelmingly supportive of Gabrielle and critical of Monarch Air. Ramirez addressed the captain again. "I recommend resolving this according to your airline's established policies for duplicate bookings, Captain. TSA needs to be notified immediately if there are actual security concerns, but not for customer service matters." With that, she nodded to Gabrielle and the Palmers, then made her way back up the aisle, followed by Officer Martinez. Their departure marked the removal of the implied threat of force that had hung over the confrontation. Captain Reynolds stood rigid, his authority publicly undermined, his tactics exposed. The calculated pressure he had attempted to apply had collapsed, leaving him with rapidly diminishing options. The departure of TSA Supervisor Ramirez and Officer Martinez created a momentary vacuum in the confrontation. The official enforcement presence that had loomed over Gabrielle was gone, removing the immediate threat of physical removal from the aircraft. This shift in dynamics was palpable throughout the cabin. Captain Reynolds, his face tight with suppressed anger, turned to Michael Bennett. "Get Lisa Kennedy up here, now!" Michael hurried toward the rear galley, returning moments later with the trainee flight attendant. Lisa's face was pale but determined as she approached. "Ms. Kennedy," the captain said, his voice clipped, "you accessed our booking system earlier and made certain claims about the reservation timestamps. I need you to verify that information again officially for the record." Lisa straightened her shoulders, acutely aware that every word was being recorded by multiple passengers. "Yes, sir. I checked the booking history for seat 3A. Dr. Wilson's reservation was made on July 15th at 10:42 a.m. The Palmer's reservation was made on October 2nd at 3:17 p.m. And what does the Monarch Air policy manual state about duplicate bookings?" Reynolds pressed his tone, suggesting he already knew the answer. Lisa swallowed, but maintained her composure. Section 4.3 of the Passenger Service Manual states that in cases of duplicate seat assignments, priority is given to the passenger with the earlier booking timestamp, unless there are documented safety considerations or pre-registered medical accommodations. "Were there any pre-registered medical accommodations for Mrs. Palmer on this flight?" the captain asked. "No, sir. There are no medical accommodations or special requests noted in the Palmer's reservation." A murmur rippled through the watching passengers. The airline's own employee had just publicly confirmed that by Monarch Air's explicit policy, Gabrielle was entitled to the seat she occupied. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, unexpectedly, Lisa Kennedy continued speaking. "Captain Reynolds, I feel I should also note that I've reviewed the passenger manifest 3 times today as part of my training exercises. The duplicate booking of seat 3A wasn't present in the system until approximately 90 minutes before boarding. It appears to have been a last-minute change rather than a long-standing duplicate reservation." This new information sent another ripple of reaction through the cabin. Marco zoomed his camera in, slightly ensuring this critical testimony was clearly captured on his live stream. "That will be all, Ms. Kennedy," Captain Reynolds said, his tone glacial. "Return to the rear galley and await further instructions." As Lisa turned to go, Gabrielle caught her eye and mouthed a silent thank you. The young flight attendant gave an almost imperceptible nod before walking away, her career potentially in jeopardy, but her integrity intact. Sophia Thompson lowered her phone briefly to address the captain directly. "So, to summarize what we've all just heard, Dr. Wilson booked her seat nearly 3 months ago. The Palmer's booking was made 2 weeks ago. There were no medical accommodations requested in advance, and according to your airline's own stated policy, Dr. Wilson has priority. Is that correct?" Captain Reynolds's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "The situation is more complex than it's a yes or no question," Sophia interrupted calmly. "Based on what your flight attendant just confirmed, does Dr. Wilson have priority for this seat according to Monarch Air policy?" Put on the spot with dozens of cameras recording his response, Reynolds had no choice. According to the booking timestamp policy, yes. Another murmur swept through the cabin, louder this time. The captain had just admitted on record that Gabrielle was entitled to the seat by the airline's own rules. "Then why," Sophia continued, "has your crew spent the last 40 minutes trying to move her instead of the Palmers? Why was security called? Why did you threaten to remove her from the flight?" Before Reynolds could formulate a response, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting subtly from frustration to concern. Without answering Sophia's questions, he stepped away to take the call, moving toward the front of the cabin for privacy. The Palmers, who had been silent during this exchange, now stood awkwardly in the aisle, their position increasingly untenable. Victoria's medical necessity claim had been exposed as fabricated. Their priority claim based on loyalty status had been undermined by the airline's own policy. The public opinion in the cabin had shifted decisively against them. Richard Palmer, sensing the changing tide, attempted to save face. "This has gone on long enough. We'll take seats elsewhere." But Victoria wasn't ready to concede. "This is outrageous. We've been Platinum Elite members for 8 years. We spend thousands of dollars with this airline. That should count for something." "It does," Gabrielle replied, breaking her silence. "It counts for excellent service, priority boarding, free checked bags, and all the other benefits of your loyalty program. What it doesn't count for is the right to take something that belongs to someone else." The simple truth of this statement resonated throughout the cabin. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Monarch Air's loyalty program, like all such programs, offered many privileges, but it didn't override basic fairness or contractual agreements. While the confrontation continued in the cabin of Flight 447, the digital documentation of the incident was spreading across the internet at an exponential rate. Marco Rodriguez's live stream, which had begun with just his travel vlog followers, had now reached over 50,000 concurrent viewers. The hashtag #Seat3A was trending on Twitter with clips from the stream being shared and commented upon by thousands. "This is in real time, people," Marco narrated quietly to his audience. "We're watching as Monarch Air staff tried to force Dr. Wilson out of her rightfully assigned seat, called security on her, and threatened to remove her from the flight. All because they gave priority to these other passengers despite their own policy saying Dr. Wilson should keep her seat." Comments flooded the stream. "This is exactly what happened to my cousin on Monarch Air last month. I'm canceling my Monarch Air credit card right now. She's so calm. I would have lost it by now. At Monarch Air, your stock is dropping while we watch this." Literally. Indeed, as the live stream gained traction, financial news sites had picked up the story. Monarch Air's stock had begun to dip as traders anticipated the public relations disaster that was unfolding. Business analysts were already speculating about the potential damage to the airline's reputation and bottom line. Major news outlets had noticed the trending topic and were reaching out to Marco through the live stream comments requesting permission to use his footage in their coverage. Several had dispatched reporters to JFK to await the resolution of the situation. Within the cabin, passengers were receiving texts and notifications from friends and family who had seen the live stream. The awareness that this had transcended from a local dispute to a national news story was beginning to dawn on everyone involved. Captain Reynolds returned from his phone call, his demeanor noticeably different. The confidence and authority he had projected earlier were replaced by a tightly controlled anxiety. He conferred briefly with Michael Bennett, their conversation too quiet to be overheard, but their body language suggesting urgency. Michael approached the Palmers, speaking in low tones. Victoria shook her head emphatically while Richard placed a restraining hand on her arm, his expression grim. After a brief but intense exchange, the Palmers reluctantly followed Michael toward the front of the cabin where alternative seating was apparently being arranged. Simultaneously, a notification popped up on passengers' phones from the Monarch Air app. Flight 447 to LAX departure delayed. New estimated departure time 1:45 p.m. The delay was now official, extending 90 minutes beyond the original schedule. Frustrated sighs and muttered complaints spread through the cabin, but notably the anger was no longer directed at Gabrielle. The live stream and the conversations it had sparked had clarified the true source of the disruption, the airline's mishandling of a simple booking error. As word of the viral situation spread through the terminal passengers waiting to board, other Monarch Air flights began sharing and discussing the live stream. Customer service representatives at Monarch Air gates were being questioned about the incident by concerned travelers. The digital explosion had breached the confines of Flight 447 and was now affecting the airline's operations beyond this single aircraft. Inside the corporate headquarters of Monarch Air, the crisis management team had assembled in emergency session. CEO Julia Blackwell watched the live stream footage with growing horror, recognizing the severity of what was unfolding. How did this escalate to security involvement, she demanded of her executive team. Why wasn't this resolved according to our own policy? The PR director, ashen-faced, replied, "It's going nuclear on social media. We're seeing hashtags trending #boycott Monarch Air, Seat 3A, #flying while black. Multiple news outlets have picked it up. Our call centers are being flooded with cancellation requests." Julia made a decision. "Get me a direct line to Captain Reynolds. Now." In the sleek, modernist boardroom of Monarch Air's headquarters in Atlanta, the crisis management team worked frantically to contain the rapidly expanding disaster. Screens around the room displayed various metrics of the unfolding catastrophe. The live stream with its growing viewer count, the plummeting stock price, the explosion of negative social media mentions, and the flood of customer service complaints pouring in through every channel. CEO Julia Blackwell, a former pilot who had climbed the corporate ladder through operations and management, paced the length of the conference table. At 52, she had navigated the airline through post-9/11 security changes, economic downturns, and fuel crises. But nothing had prepared her for the speed and ferocity of this social media firestorm. "Give me the latest numbers," she demanded. The chief marketing officer swiped through his tablet. "The original live stream has over 100,000 concurrent viewers now. Clips are being shared across all platforms. Total views are approaching 1 million. Major news networks are picking it up. The hashtag boycott Monarch Air is trending nationally." Stock price. The CFO grimaced. Down 7% and falling. Trading volume is spiking. Investors are getting nervous. Customer impact. The VP of Customer Experience looked up from her laptop. "Call center volume is up 800%. Our social media accounts are being flooded. We're seeing a significant spike in refund and cancellation requests, especially for flights today and tomorrow." Julia stopped pacing and faced the team directly. How did this happen? How did a simple duplicate booking turn into this catastrophe? The silence that followed was damning. Finally, the chief operating officer spoke up. "Initial reports suggest Captain Reynolds and the cabin crew gave preferential treatment to the Platinum Elite passengers, despite our own policy clearly favoring the passenger with the earlier booking. When she refused to move, they escalated to security involvement rather than following protocol. And nobody thought to simply check the booking timestamps," Julia asked incredulously. "A trainee flight attendant did," the COO replied. "She confirmed the earlier passenger had priority according to policy but was apparently dismissed by the senior crew. A trainee was the only one who followed basic procedure." Julia's voice rose in disbelief. Where was the oversight? Where was the accountability? The room fell silent again. On the main screen, the live stream continued to show the tense standoff in the cabin of Flight 447. The composed dignity of Dr. Gabrielle Wilson contrasted sharply with the increasingly defensive posture of the airline staff. Julia made a decision. "Get me Captain Reynolds on the phone, now." Her assistant dialed quickly, putting the call on speakerphone through the conference room system. After 2 rings, Reynolds answered. "Captain Reynolds speaking. Edward, this is Julia Blackwell." Her tone was controlled but ice cold. "I'm in the crisis management room with the executive leadership team. We're watching this situation unfold in real time along with approximately 100,000 other people at this moment. I need you to explain to me why you're violating our own explicit policy on duplicate bookings." Reynolds' voice came through tense and defensive. CEO Blackwell. "The situation is more complex than it appears. We have loyal Platinum Elite customers who stop." Julia cut him off. "I don't want explanations. I don't want justifications. I want this resolved immediately in accordance with our policies. The passenger with the earlier booking timestamp keeps her seat. Period. But the Palmers have been loyal customers for years, and Mrs. Palmer claims a medical." Edward Julia interrupted again, her voice dangerously quiet. "Let me be perfectly clear. You are currently the public face of what may become the most expensive customer service disaster in our airline's history. Our stock is in free fall. We're trending nationally for all the wrong reasons, and every second this continues, the damage compounds." The line went silent for a moment before Reynolds responded. "What would you like me to do?" Dr. Wilson keeps her original seat. "The Palmers are to be offered our sincere apologies and appropriate compensation for the inconvenience, but they will be reseated. You will personally apologize to Dr. Wilson for the way this situation was handled, and you will get that plane in the air as quickly as possible to limit further damage." "Yes, ma'am," Reynolds replied, the fight gone from his voice. And Edward? Julia added, "This conversation will be reviewed extensively in the coming days. The decisions that led to this point will be thoroughly investigated." "Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." The call ended. Julia turned back to her team, her expression grim. "This is damage control now. I want a public statement drafted immediately acknowledging the mistake and apologizing. Contact Dr. Wilson's representatives as soon as possible to begin making amends. And I want a complete audit of our training procedures, especially regarding selective enforcement of policies based on loyalty status." The PR director nodded. "Should we offer compensation to all passengers on that flight for the delay? Yes, premium vouchers for everyone. And prepare a more substantial settlement package for Dr. Wilson, though I suspect this may end up in litigation regardless." The team dispersed to their tasks with renewed urgency. Julia remained standing, watching the live stream as Captain Reynolds returned to the confrontation point. The corporate damage control machine was now in full motion, but she knew with sinking certainty that some bells couldn't be unrung. The images of security personnel surrounding a calm, professional black woman for simply sitting in her assigned seat had already been seen by hundreds of thousands. In the cutthroat airline industry, with razor-thin profit margins and fierce competition, reputation was everything, and Monarch Air's reputation was at this very moment in freefall. Captain Reynolds returned to row 3, his demeanor markedly changed. The authoritative, almost intimidating presence he had projected earlier was replaced by a stiff professionalism that barely masked his discomfort. Michael Bennett followed close behind, his expression similarly constrained. The captain cleared his throat before addressing Gabrielle directly. "Dr. Wilson, after reviewing the situation more thoroughly and consulting with our corporate office, I need to inform you that you are correct. According to our booking policy, your earlier reservation does take precedence in this seating conflict." The admission hung in the air for a moment. Marco zoomed in slightly on his live stream, ensuring viewers could clearly see the captain's face during this remarkable reversal. As such, Reynolds continued, "You are welcome to remain in your assigned seat, 3A, for the duration of this flight. The Palmers have been accommodated with alternative seating in our first-class cabin. On behalf of Monarch Air, I apologize for the confusion and any inconvenience this situation may have caused." The apology was technically complete, but notably devoid of any acknowledgement of the intimidation tactics, security involvement, or discriminatory treatment that had characterized the preceding hour. It was the bare minimum required by corporate headquarters, delivered with all the warmth of a pre-recorded message. Gabrielle regarded him steadily for a moment before responding. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate the acknowledgement of my booking priority. However, I want to be clear that what transpired here went well beyond confusion or inconvenience. It involved attempts to intimidate me into giving up my rightful seat, security personnel being called without justification, and different standards being applied to different passengers." Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he offered no further comment or apology. After an uncomfortable moment of silence, he turned and walked back toward the cockpit, effectively ending the conversation without addressing the deeper issues Gabrielle had raised. Michael remained behind, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Dr. Wilson, we'll be resuming our pre-departure service shortly. Can I offer you a beverage before takeoff?" "No, thank you," Gabrielle replied. "I would, however, appreciate having the contact information for Monarch Air's Customer Relations Department." "Of course," Michael said, producing a business card from his pocket. "Again, we apologize for any misunderstanding." As Michael retreated, the tension in the cabin began to dissipate, replaced by a buzz of conversation as passengers processed the dramatic resolution. The Palmers could be seen near the front of the first-class cabin, Victoria gesticulating animatedly, while Richard sat with slumped shoulders, the fight gone out of him. Marco ended his live stream with a final commentary. "There you have it, folks. After an hour of confrontation, Monarch Air has finally acknowledged that Dr. Wilson had the right to her seat all along. But the questions remain. Why was she treated this way in the first place? Why did it take a viral live stream and corporate intervention to enforce their own policy? And what happens to all these airline employees who were willing to remove a paying customer from her rightfully assigned seat? I'll be following this story as it develops. This is Marco Rodriguez signing off from Monarch Air Flight 447. With the immediate conflict resolved, passengers began to settle back into their pre-flight routines. Several approached Gabrielle briefly to express support or admiration for her composure. Others shared their own stories of airline mistreatment, forming a spontaneous community of solidarity. Nathan Cohen leaned across the aisle. "That was remarkably handled, Dr. Wilson. I've never seen someone maintain such dignity under pressure." "Thank you," Gabrielle replied, "though I wish it hadn't been necessary." Sophia Thompson, who had been methodically documenting the entire confrontation, approached from her seat. "Dr. Wilson, I'm an attorney with Thompson Legal Group. I specialize in consumer rights cases. If you'd like to discuss this incident further after we land, I'd be happy to provide some perspective on your options." Gabrielle accepted Sophia's business card with a thoughtful nod. "I appreciate that. I expect I'll have some decisions to make once the dust settles." As the cabin crew resumed their pre-departure duties, a new announcement came over the intercom, not from Captain Reynolds this time, but from the first officer. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the extended delay. We're currently completing our pre-flight checks and should be pushing back from the gate in approximately 15 minutes. We thank you for your patience and understanding." Just as Flight 447 began to taxi toward the runway, the cabin intercom crackled to life once more. Captain Reynolds' voice came through tense and clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we need to return to the gate due to an operational issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we have come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." A collective groan rose from the passengers. After the extended confrontation and delay, this additional setback was the last thing anyone wanted. Speculation rippled through the cabin about technical problems or weather issues, as the aircraft slowly turned and began making its way back to the terminal. First Officer Sarah Jenkins emerged from the cockpit and approached the lead flight attendant, Michael Bennett. Their hushed conversation was brief but intense, with Michael's expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. When they reached the gate, the seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been instructed by Monarch Air Corporate Operations to temporarily deplane certain passengers for a special consultation. When I call your name, please gather your belongings and proceed to the front of the aircraft. Dr. Gabrielle Wilson." A murmur of confusion and concern spread through the cabin. After everything that had transpired, Gabrielle was being asked to leave the aircraft. "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Palmer," the captain continued. The confusion intensified. Both parties in the seating dispute were being deplaned. Marco immediately resumed recording. "They're removing both Dr. Wilson and the Palmers from the flight. After all this, they're actually taking her off the plane." Gabrielle sat motionless for a moment, processing this new development. Then, with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the confrontation, she gathered her belongings and stood. As she moved into the aisle, several passengers reached out to touch her arm or shoulder in gestures of solidarity. "This isn't right, Nathan," Cohen said loudly. After acknowledging she was entitled to her seat, "They're still removing her." The Palmers were already making their way to the front, Victoria's face flushed with indignation, Richard's with embarrassment. As Gabrielle followed them up the aisle, a remarkable thing happened. Passengers began to stand as she passed. It wasn't a coordinated protest or a planned demonstration. It was a spontaneous expression of respect and solidarity. One by one, then, in small groups, passengers rose from their seats, not blocking the aisle, but standing in place, bearing witness to what was happening. Lisa Kennedy, the trainee flight attendant who had confirmed Gabrielle's booking priority earlier, caught her eye as she passed the rear galley. "I'm so sorry," she whispered just loudly enough for Gabrielle to hear. Gabrielle nodded in acknowledgement of both the apology and the courage it had taken for Lisa to speak up earlier. That small act of integrity had been a crucial turning point in the confrontation, providing official confirmation of what Gabrielle had been stating all along. As she reached the front of the aircraft, a Monarch Air representative waited at the door. Not a gate agent, but Danielle Foster, the station manager for JFK, hastily dispatched from her office to handle the high-profile incident. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes conveyed the gravity of the situation. "Dr. Wilson. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, please follow me. We have a private room where we can discuss this matter further." As they stepped off the aircraft, Gabrielle turned back briefly, surveying the cabin where dozens of passengers still stood in silent support. It was a powerful image, the physical manifestation of the public reckoning that had begun online and was now taking tangible form in the real world. Marco captured the moment on video, narrating quietly, "Dr. Wilson is leaving with her head held high while half the cabin stands in solidarity. I've never seen anything like this in all my years of travel." The trio followed Danielle through the jet bridge and into the terminal where a startling scene awaited them. News cameras were positioned near the gate area, held back by airport security, but clearly there in response to the viral incident. Travelers in the terminal recognized Gabrielle from the live-stream footage, some nodding in recognition or offering words of support as she passed. Victoria Palmer, seeing the media presence, instinctively raised a hand to shield her face, a gesture captured by multiple cameras and destined to become one of the defining images of the incident. Richard walked with his eyes downcast, the public exposure clearly taking its toll. Gabrielle, by contrast, maintained her composure. She walked steadily, head high, neither seeking the spotlight nor shying away from it. Her dignity in this moment would later be described by commentators as a masterclass in grace under pressure. As they disappeared into a private airport lounge, the passengers of Flight 447 remained in a state of uncertain limbo, wondering what would happen next and whether the flight would eventually depart. But one thing was already clear to everyone who had witnessed these events unfold. Something significant had just occurred, something that transcended a simple seating dispute and touched on deeper issues of fairness, respect, and accountability. And the world was watching. The private airport lounge had been hastily converted into an improvised crisis management center. On one side sat Gabrielle Wilson, composed but alert, flanked by two individuals who had been waiting for her at the gate. Jennifer Patterson, the aviation attorney she had called from the aircraft, and Marcus Johnson, her literary agent who had been alerted to the situation via social media. On the opposite side sat the Palmers, Richard looking defeated while Victoria maintained her indignant posture despite the crumbling of her position. Between them was an empty chair, currently unoccupied, as Danielle Foster, the station manager, consulted urgently with corporate representatives via video conference on a tablet. Outside in the terminal, the scene was approaching chaos. News crews from every major network had arrived, setting up impromptu broadcasting positions where airport regulations permitted. Social media influencers were live streaming from the gate area, providing commentary and updates to audiences hungry for developments. Passengers from Flight 447, some who had chosen to deplane rather than wait in uncertainty, were giving impromptu interviews about what they had witnessed. Marco Rodriguez had emerged as a central figure in the narrative, his original live stream having captured the confrontation in its entirety. He was now surrounded by reporters describing the events with the measured precision of someone who understood the importance of accurate documentation. What we witnessed today wasn't just about a seat, he explained to a CNN correspondent. It was about how different people are treated when they assert the same rights, Dr. Wilson was polite, professional, and completely within her rights the entire time, yet she was treated as the problem. Security was called on her for simply sitting in her assigned seat. Online, the explosion continued unabated. Monarch Air's stock had plummeted further now, down 17% on extraordinary trading volume, a single-day decline unprecedented in the company's history. Financial analysts were issuing revised guidance questioning the airline's ability to recover from the reputational damage. Competitor airlines were seeing modest gains as traders bet on passengers shifting their business away from Monarch Air. The hashtag #boycott Monarch Air had been joined by others, #I stand with seat 3A, flying, while black, #first class citizen. Memes and reaction videos were proliferating across platforms. Clips from the confrontation were being analyzed frame by frame, with body language experts and civil rights attorneys offering their perspectives on news programs. Back in the lounge, Danielle Foster returned to the waiting group, her professional demeanor strained by the enormity of the situation she was attempting to manage. "I've just spoken with our CEO, Julia Blackwell," she began, addressing all parties. "First, on behalf of Monarch Air, I want to extend our sincerest apologies to Dr. Wilson for the way this situation was handled. It represents a clear failure to follow our own policies and procedures." Jennifer Patterson, Gabrielle's attorney, interjected smoothly. "While we appreciate the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, this goes far beyond a procedural failure. My client was subjected to discriminatory treatment, public humiliation, and implicit threats. Security personnel were called without justification. This constitutes a violation of her civil rights and breaches both your contract of carriage and federal aviation regulations regarding equal treatment of passengers." Danielle nodded, recognizing the shift from corporate apology to legal territory. "We understand the seriousness of the situation. Monarch Air is prepared to offer immediate compensation as a preliminary gesture of goodwill, while we work toward a more comprehensive resolution." "We're not interested in preliminary gestures," Jennifer replied firmly. "My client requires formal acknowledgement of the discriminatory nature of the incident, commitment to structural changes in policy enforcement, and appropriate compensation for the emotional distress and professional disruption she has experienced." Victoria Palmer, who had been unusually quiet until this point, suddenly spoke up. "This is ridiculous. We're being treated like criminals when all we did was try to sit in the seats we paid for." Jennifer turned her cool gaze to Victoria. "Mrs. Palmer, with all due respect, there is extensive video documentation of your behavior during this incident, including several comments with clear racial implications. I would strongly advise you to consult with your own legal counsel before making any further public statements." Richard Palmer placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, finally recognizing the depth of the hole they had dug for themselves. Gabrielle, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "What I want more than anything is acknowledgement, not just of the policy violation, but of the fundamental inequity in how I was treated. And I want assurance that the next person who looks like me won't face the same treatment for simply occupying the space they've rightfully purchased." Her words, measured and precise, cut to the heart of the matter in a way that legal language could not. This wasn't merely about compensation or policy changes. It was about basic dignity and equal treatment in public spaces. Danielle Foster nodded slowly. "Dr. Wilson, I can't speak for the entire company in this moment, but I can tell you personally that what happened today was wrong on multiple levels. It represents a failure that goes beyond procedures to questions of fundamental fairness. And while I can't promise that we will solve every aspect of this issue immediately, I can assure you that this incident will catalyze significant changes at Monarch Air." Outside in the terminal, the media circus continued to grow. Monarch Air representatives were being bombarded with questions they weren't authorized to answer. Competitors were already adjusting their marketing strategies, emphasizing their commitment to fairness and respect for all passengers. The explosion had moved beyond social media to become a cultural moment, one that would be analyzed in business schools, discussed in corporate boardrooms, and referenced in conversations about race privilege and accountability for years to come. And at the center of it all was Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, who had wanted nothing more than to travel to Los Angeles to deliver her presentation on revolutionary burn treatment technology. Instead, she had become the focal point of a national conversation about who belongs in which spaces, whose rights are automatically respected, and whose must be defended at every turn. 3 hours after the initial confrontation, Gabrielle sat in a quiet corner of an executive airport lounge, surrounded by a rapidly assembled response team. Jennifer Patterson, the aviation attorney, had been joined by civil rights attorney Devin Williams, who specialized in discrimination cases. Marcus Johnson, her literary agent, was fielding an extraordinary volume of media requests. And Dr. Rachel Thompson, a longtime friend and fellow medical researcher, had arrived to provide both emotional support and assistance in rearranging Gabrielle's conference presentation schedule. "The immediate priority is getting you to Los Angeles," Rachel said, reviewing the flight options on her tablet. "There's a competitor airline flight leaving in 2 hours. I've already secured you a first-class ticket." Jennifer nodded. "From a legal perspective, I actually recommend accepting that option rather than continuing on the delayed Monarch Air flight. It creates a clear record of the disruption to your professional obligations." Gabrielle sipped her water, considering the options. "My presentation isn't until tomorrow afternoon. There's still time to make it even with the delay. It's not just about making it to the presentation," Marcus pointed out. "It's about arriving with enough rest and preparation time to deliver it effectively. This incident has already taken a toll, whether you recognize it yet or not." Devin Williams, who had been reviewing the social media documentation of the confrontation on his laptop, looked up. "Dr. Wilson, I want to outline the potential legal approaches we could take. This incident presents multiple avenues for action, including civil rights violations, breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of DOT regulations regarding discriminatory practices by airlines. I'm not interested in pursuing this primarily for financial gain," Gabrielle replied. "What I want is accountability and change." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Jennifer noted. "In fact, significant financial consequences are often what motivate corporations to implement meaningful structural changes. It's unfortunate but true that policy revisions without financial penalties tend to be cosmetic rather than substantive." Devin nodded in agreement. "Additionally, we should consider the broader impact. This case has the potential to set precedent for how airlines handle similar situations in the future. It's about more than just what happened to you today." Marcus showed Gabrielle his phone displaying a stream of messages from major news outlets, talk shows, and online publications. "The media interest is unprecedented. Everyone wants your perspective. How do you want to approach this? We could issue a written statement schedule, select interviews, or maintain silence while the legal process unfolds." Gabrielle took a moment to absorb the overwhelming cascade of decisions before her. The simple act of maintaining her rightful seat had transformed into something far larger than she had anticipated. Her actions and words from this point forward would shape not only the resolution of her own situation, but potentially the experiences of countless future travelers. "Here's what I want," she said finally, her voice clear and determined. "I want a strategic approach that prioritizes substantive change over spectacle. I don't want to be a momentary hashtag. I want to be the catalyst for lasting reform in how airlines treat all passengers." Jennifer made notes as Gabrielle continued. "Legally, I want to pursue whatever avenues will create binding commitments to change with verification mechanisms and transparency requirements. Media-wise, I want a measured approach, a single, comprehensive statement initially followed by select interviews with journalists who have demonstrated thoughtful coverage of similar issues." Rachel squeezed her friend's hand supportively. "What about your immediate travel plans and the conference? I'll take the competitor flight," Gabrielle decided. "Not out of spite toward Monarch Air, but because it's the most practical solution for ensuring I can deliver my presentation effectively. The work I'm presenting tomorrow has the potential to help thousands of burn victims. I won't let today's events overshadow that purpose." Devin nodded approvingly. "That's a powerful perspective, maintaining focus on your larger mission while addressing this incident appropriately." As the team continued developing their strategy, Gabrielle's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Monarch Air CEO Julia Blackwell requesting a private conversation. She showed it to Jennifer, who read it carefully. "This is unusual," Jennifer noted. "CEOs typically maintain distance during potential litigation, communicating only through legal channels. The fact that she's reaching out directly suggests they recognize the severity of the situation." "Should I accept?" Gabrielle asked. "Yes, but with conditions," Jennifer advised. "Request that I be present and ask for clarity on the purpose and parameters of the conversation beforehand." As Gabrielle composed her response, Marcus showed her his tablet displaying a new development that was trending online. Lisa Kennedy, the trainee flight attendant who had confirmed Gabrielle's booking priority, had apparently been suspended pending an investigation into unauthorized access of passenger information and breach of chain of command protocols. "They're punishing the one employee who actually followed policy and told the truth," Gabrielle said, dismayed, but not entirely surprised. "That speaks volumes about the corporate culture we're dealing with." Devon made a note. "This strengthens our position regarding the need for structural change, not just an apology and compensation." Outside the lounge, the media presence continued to grow. What had begun as a seating dispute had evolved into a complex examination of privilege, corporate accountability, and racial dynamics in commercial spaces. And through it all, Gabrielle maintained the same calm, strategic approach that had characterized her response from the beginning, not seeking conflict, but refusing to accept injustice. The response team worked methodically, building a comprehensive strategy that would leverage this moment toward meaningful change, while ensuring that Gabrielle's immediate professional obligations and personal well-being remained priorities. It was a delicate balance, navigating between the immediate explosion of public interest and the longer-term goals of substantive reform. 3 days after the Flight 447 incident, United States District Court Judge Elena Ramirez presided over an emergency hearing in the Southern District of New York. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and interested members of the public, all drawn by the case that had dominated headlines and social media feeds for the past 72 hours. At issue was a preliminary injunction motion filed by Jennifer Patterson on behalf of Gabrielle Wilson, seeking to prevent Monarch Air from destroying, altering, or withholding any evidence related to the incident, including electronic records, internal communications, employee personnel files, and policy documents. The motion also requested court-ordered preservation of booking system data for all flights over the previous 3 years to establish patterns of policy enforcement. Monarch Air's legal team had assembled a formidable defense led by senior partner William Harrington from the prestigious firm of Davidson Harrington and Reed. His argument focused on the breadth of the requested discovery, which he characterized as a fishing expedition designed to harass the airline rather than address the specific incident in question. Judge Ramirez, known for her no-nonsense approach and meticulous preparation, had clearly reviewed the extensive documentation submitted with Gabrielle's motion, including transcripts and video footage from multiple passengers. "Mr. Harrington," she began, "your client's public statements acknowledge that Dr. Wilson's booking predated the Palmers by several months, and that Monarch Air policy explicitly gives priority to earlier bookings in cases of duplicate assignments. Yet your staff attempted to move Dr. Wilson rather than the Palmers, called security without justification, and threatened her with removal from the aircraft. Can you explain the discrepancy between your policies and their enforcement in this instance?" Harrington attempted to frame the incident as a regrettable miscommunication that had been exaggerated by selective social media coverage. This characterization drew a skeptical response from the judge. "I've reviewed over 2 hours of unedited video footage from multiple angles," Judge Ramirez noted. "It appears to show a consistent pattern of your employees attempting to coerce Dr. Wilson into giving up her rightful seat, despite being informed multiple times of her earlier booking. This doesn't strike me as a miscommunication issue." After lengthy arguments from both sides, Judge Ramirez issued her ruling. a sweeping preliminary injunction requiring Monarch Air to preserve all evidence potentially relevant to the case, including the personnel files of all employees involved in the incident. All internal communications regarding the handling of duplicate bookings and comprehensive data on seating dispute resolutions across the airline's operations for the past 3 years. Additionally, and perhaps most significantly, she ordered the immediate production of Captain Reynolds's personnel file, including any previous complaints or disciplinary actions related to passenger treatment or policy enforcement. The public interest in ensuring that commercial airlines adhere to non-discriminatory practices is substantial, Judge Ramirez stated in her ruling. The evidence presented suggests a concerning pattern of selective policy enforcement that merits thorough investigation. The decision represented a significant legal victory for Gabrielle and set the stage for what promised to be extensive discovery if the case proceeded to trial. Legal observers noted that the scope of the preservation order was unusually broad, reflecting the judge's assessment that the incident potentially indicated institutional issues rather than isolated misconduct. As details from the hearing spread across news outlets and social media, attention focused on the judge's order regarding Captain Reynolds's personnel file. Within hours of the ruling, unnamed sources within Monarch Air leaked information that Reynolds had indeed been the subject of 3 previous complaints regarding discriminatory treatment of passengers, none of which had resulted in disciplinary action. This revelation dramatically undercut Monarch Air's narrative that the incident was an isolated lapse rather than a manifestation of deeper institutional problems. Financial analysts issued revised guidance predicting increased legal liability and further damage to the airline's reputation and market position. Monarch Air's stock, which had stabilized somewhat after the initial plunge, dropped an additional 8% following news of the court ruling and the personnel file revelations. Credit rating agency Moody's placed the airline's debt on review for potential downgrade, citing heightened legal and reputational risks that may impact operational and financial performance. For Gabrielle, who had just successfully delivered her conference presentation on synthetic skin graft technology to a standing ovation from her medical colleagues, the legal victory represented validation of her decision to pursue accountability rather than accepting a private settlement. Her attorney, Jennifer Patterson, issued a brief statement. Today's ruling ensures that the full facts surrounding this incident will be brought to light, Dr. Wilson remains committed to seeking meaningful institutional change rather than merely personal compensation. The ruling also had immediate ripple effects throughout the airline industry. Competing carriers accelerated internal reviews of their own policies regarding duplicate bookings, loyalty program priorities, and employee training on non-discrimination. Legal departments issued urgent guidance to frontline staff emphasizing the importance of consistent policy enforcement regardless of passenger status. Captain Edward Reynolds, who had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, retained personal counsel separate from Monarch Air's legal team, a sign that tensions were developing between the airline and the employees who had carried out what increasingly appeared to be unofficial but widespread practices. The Flight Attendants Union issued a statement expressing concern that frontline employees are being scapegoated for carrying out unwritten expectations from management regarding preferential treatment for high-status passengers. This suggested the possibility of additional whistleblowers emerging as the case proceeded. As evening fell on the 3rd day after Flight 447, the landscape had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a confrontation over a single seat had evolved into a legal process with potentially industry-wide implications, a financial crisis threatening one of the nation's largest airlines, and a moment of reckoning for corporate practices long accepted as standard, but increasingly recognized as problematic. And at the center of it all remained Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, not seeking the spotlight, but unwavering in her commitment to ensuring that what had happened to her would not continue to happen to others. 6 months after the Flight 447 incident, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson stood at the podium of the National Medical Innovation Conference presenting the remarkable results of her team's extended clinical trials. The synthetic skin graft technology she had been traveling to discuss on that fateful flight had exceeded even the most optimistic projections, showing a 92% reduction in rejection rates and cutting recovery time by 60% compared to traditional treatments. This advancement means that burn victims worldwide will face significantly improved outcomes, particularly in regions with limited medical resources, she explained to the rapt audience of medical professionals and researchers. The simplified application protocol and reduced need for immunosuppressants make this treatment viable even in settings without specialized burn units. The standing ovation that followed recognized not only the scientific achievement, but also the woman behind it, a researcher whose dignity and determination had catalyzed change far beyond her laboratory. As Gabrielle accepted the conference's Innovation Impact Award, the medical community's highest honor for translational research, few could separate the scientist from the symbol she had become. Outside the medical sphere, the changes sparked by the Flight 447 confrontation had continued to reverberate across the commercial aviation landscape. The settlement between Gabrielle and Monarch Air, finalized 4 months after the incident, had established new benchmarks for corporate accountability in discrimination cases. The financial terms remained confidential, but the structural changes were made public in a joint announcement that industry analysts described as unprecedented in scope and specificity. These included the establishment of the Wilson Protocol for resolving seating disputes, which mandated strict adherence to booking timestamp priority, regardless of loyalty status, with any exceptions requiring documented safety or accessibility needs. Mandatory quarterly audits of policy enforcement across all Monarch Air flights, with results published publicly and tied directly to executive compensation metrics. Comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff, developed in partnership with leading civil rights organizations and incorporating real-world scenarios based on documented incidents. The creation of a passenger advocate position at every major hub airport, empowered to intervene in real time when customers experienced potential discriminatory treatment. A significant financial commitment to the newly established Wilson Foundation for Equity in Public Spaces, dedicated to researching and addressing differential treatment in commercial services. This last element represented Gabrielle's most personal priority in the settlement negotiations. Rather than seeking maximum personal compensation, she had directed a substantial portion of the settlement toward creating an organization that would extend the impact of her individual experience to benefit others facing similar situations without her advantages of documentation, legal representation, and public attention. The Wilson Foundation will focus on 3 core areas, explained Executive Director Maya Johnson at the launch event. Research that documents patterns of differential treatment in public accommodations. Education that helps service providers recognize and address implicit biases. And advocacy that amplifies the voices of those who experience discrimination in commercial settings. The Foundation's first initiative, a nationwide study of booking and seating practices across all major airlines, was already producing valuable data on disparities in how policies were applied to different demographic groups. Early findings suggested that passengers from minority groups were approximately 4 times more likely to be asked to change seats or flights than white passengers with equivalent bookings and status. For Monarch Air, the settlement and subsequent reforms represented the beginning of a long journey toward rebuilding both financial stability and public trust. Under CEO Ramon Vasquez's leadership, the company had embraced transparency as its core recovery strategy, acknowledging past failures while documenting ongoing efforts to address the underlying issues. We recognize that trust is earned through actions, not statements, Vasquez emphasized in quarterly updates to shareholders and customers. Each policy change, each training program, each audit result represents another step toward becoming the airline we should have been all along. The strategy was showing preliminary signs of success. After hitting a low of 58% of pre-incident value, Monarch Air stock had recovered to approximately 70%, with analysts noting improved customer satisfaction metrics and reduced complaint rates. While still far from complete recovery, the trajectory suggested that authentic accountability might ultimately prove more financially sound than the defensive approaches that had characterized previous corporate crises. Throughout the industry, the Wilson effect continued to drive policy changes and enhanced oversight. The Department of Transportation's Equity and Commercial Aviation Task Force, on which Gabrielle served as a special advisor, had issued preliminary recommendations for regulatory reforms, including mandatory reporting of all involuntary seating changes with demographic data to identify potential patterns of discriminatory enforcement. Competitor airlines, initially quick to distance themselves from Monarch Air's practices, now faced increased scrutiny of their own operations. Several had proactively implemented reforms similar to the Wilson Protocol, recognizing that the heightened attention to equity issues represented a permanent shift in customer expectations rather than a temporary news cycle. For Gabrielle personally, the 6 months since Flight 447 had brought both extraordinary opportunities and significant challenges. The public attention had created platforms for advancing equity that would have been otherwise inaccessible, but it had also imposed demands that competed with her scientific work and disrupted the privacy she valued. She had navigated this new reality with the same measured approach that had characterized her response during the original confrontation, neither seeking the spotlight nor shirking the responsibility that had unexpectedly come her way. She accepted speaking engagements selectively, focusing on venues where her perspective could influence institutional practices rather than generate headlines. As she left the stage of the National Medical Innovation Conference, Gabrielle paused briefly to check her calendar. Tomorrow morning, she would meet with the Wilson Foundation Board to review grant applications from researchers documenting discrimination in healthcare settings. In the afternoon, she would return to her laboratory to continue refining the synthetic skin graft protocol for deployment in resource-limited environments. 6 months after a simple refusal to give up her rightfully assigned seat, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson was still focused on creating spaces where everyone could thrive, whether in the healing of damaged skin or in the healing of damaged systems. The unexpected platform she had gained was being used not for personal advancement, but for advancing the principle at the heart of her original stand, that dignity should not be a privilege for some, but a right for all. The Monarch Air Training Facility in Atlanta buzzed with anticipation as a new cohort of flight attendants gathered for their first day of orientation. At the front of the room stood Lisa Kennedy, no longer a trainee, but now the Director of Service Equity Training, a position created in the aftermath of the Flight 447 incident that had transformed both her career and the airline industry. Welcome to Monarch Air. Lisa began her confidence a stark contrast to the nervous trainee who had dared to speak truth 6 months earlier. Today marks the beginning of not just your career with our airline, but your role in our ongoing commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The journey from that tense confrontation in first class to this leadership position had been neither simple nor straightforward. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Lisa had faced both retaliation and recognition threats and opportunities, criticism and praise, often simultaneously and from different factions within the company. When video of the confrontation first went viral, Monarch Air's initial instinct had been damage control through scapegoating. Lisa had been suspended for unauthorized system access and violation of chain of command after she confirmed Dr. Wilson's booking priority. The suspension, intended to be quiet and internal, leaked to social media within hours, creating a secondary public relations crisis as the airline was seen to be punishing the one employee who had followed proper procedures. The public backlash had been immediate and fierce. #Reinstate Kennedy trended alongside #boycott Monarch Air, with commentators noting the troubling message sent by punishing ethical behavior while protecting those who had engaged in discriminatory practices. Former flight attendants came forward with similar stories of being reprimanded for challenging preferential treatment of elite status passengers at the expense of others. For 3 anxiety-filled days, Lisa had faced not just the loss of her dream job, but potential blacklisting across the industry. Her phone filled with messages from former colleagues warning her that standing up to the corporate hierarchy could end her aviation career before it truly began. Others urged her to hire an attorney and prepare for wrongful termination litigation. The turning point came with CEO Julia Blackwell's forced resignation and the appointment of Ramon Vasquez as her replacement. One of Vasquez's first acts had been to personally call Lisa, apologize for her treatment, and not only reinstate her, but create a new role, leveraging her perspective on the failures that had led to the Flight 447 incident. "We need people who will speak truth regardless of hierarchy," he had told her. "Your actions demonstrated exactly the values this airline needs to rebuild around." The months that followed had been a whirlwind of activity. Lisa had been central to the development of the new training protocols established under the Monarch Air settlement with Dr. Wilson. She had interviewed dozens of flight attendants about their experiences with policy enforcement, uncovering patterns of informal pressure to prioritize high-status passengers regardless of official policies. Her most significant contribution had been the creation of the Ethical Service Framework, a decision-making model that helped flight attendants navigate conflicts between customer expectations, company policies, and ethical principles. The framework emphasized consistency in policy application while providing clear escalation paths when conflicts arose. In the past, Lisa now explained to the new trainees, many of you might have received unofficial guidance to make the elite customers happy at all costs, or to use your judgment in ways that often meant applying different standards to different passengers. Today, I'm going to teach you something different, how to deliver exceptional service while maintaining consistent, fair treatment for everyone. The trainees listened attentively as Lisa shared her personal experience from Flight 447, describing both the pressure she had felt to remain silent and the clarity she had found in simply verifying and stating the facts. Her story had become a powerful teaching tool, a real-world example of how speaking up in the moment could prevent escalation and protect both passengers and the company from harm. Beyond her role at Monarch Air, Lisa had emerged as a leading voice in the growing Flight Attendant Ethics Alliance, an organization she had co-founded with crew members from other airlines who shared similar experiences of being caught between official policies and unofficial expectations. The alliance provided resources, support, and advocacy for aviation workers facing ethical dilemmas in their daily interactions. Being in service roles doesn't mean abandoning our ethical compass, Lisa often emphasized in alliance meetings. In fact, it makes that compass more important because we're the frontline representatives of how these large corporations treat individual human beings. For Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, Lisa's evolution from hesitant trainee to confident advocate represented one of the most meaningful outcomes of the Flight 447 incident. The two women had met in person 3 months after the confrontation, when Gabrielle visited Atlanta to consult on the Monarch Air training reforms. "Your courage in that moment made all the difference," Gabrielle had told her during their lunch meeting. "Without your confirmation of the booking times, this might have been dismissed as just another disagreement rather than a documented case of discriminatory treatment." Lisa had been moved nearly to tears by this acknowledgement. "I almost didn't speak up," she had admitted. "I was terrified of losing my job, of challenging my superiors. But something about watching how calmly you held your ground made me realize I couldn't stay silent." That connection had developed into an ongoing professional relationship with Lisa, serving on an advisory committee for the Wilson Foundation's airline industry initiatives. Their collaboration demonstrated the power of allyship across different positions and perspectives. The passenger and the crew member both committed to creating a more equitable experience for everyone. Now, as Lisa guided her trainees through scenarios based on real-world service conflicts, she embodied the transformation that was gradually reshaping Monarch Air from within. The company's recovery remained fragile, its reputation still damaged by the Flight 447 incident, But in classrooms like this one, the foundation was being laid for a different kind of service culture. "The most important thing I want you to take from today," Lisa told the trainees as their first session concluded, "is that doing the right thing and doing your job well are not in conflict. They're the same thing. The moment we start believing we need to compromise one for the other is the moment we begin to fail as individuals, as an airline, and as representatives of how people should treat each other." The modest suburban home outside Seattle bore little resemblance to the executive residence Edward Reynolds had occupied 6 months earlier. Gone was the lakefront view, the 3-car garage, the carefully landscaped garden maintained by weekly service. In their place was a rental property, comfortable but ordinary, with a small yard and aging furniture visible through the windows. Inside, the former Monarch Air captain sat at his kitchen table reviewing yet another rejection email from a regional airline. "After careful consideration of your application and experience, we regret to inform you that we will not be proceeding with your candidacy at this time." The carefully worded message contained no explicit reference to Flight 447 or the subsequent investigation that had led to Reynolds losing his pilot's license. It didn't need to. His name had become synonymous with the incident that aviation industry publications now routinely cited as a case study in catastrophic leadership failure. The consequences of that failure had been comprehensive and devastating. The FAA investigation triggered by the incident had uncovered a pattern of concerning decisions throughout Reynolds's career, not just the discriminatory enforcement of seating policies, but multiple instances of using his authority in ways that prioritized status over safety, efficiency over equity, and personal judgment over established procedures. Particularly damaging was the psychological evaluation that had been ordered as part of the investigation. The report had identified concerning rigidity in decision-making, resistance to external input, and difficulty acknowledging error traits that had directly contributed to the escalation of the Flight 447 confrontation from a simple booking discrepancy to a corporate crisis. Based on this evaluation and the documented pattern of judgment issues, the FAA had revoked Reynolds's air transport pilot license, effectively ending his flying career after 27 years. The decision had been upheld on appeal, with the review board noting that the responsibilities of aircraft command require not only technical proficiency but sound judgment, particularly regarding passenger safety and well-being. The professional consequences had been matched by personal and financial repercussions. Reynolds' wife of 20 years had filed for divorce, unable to reconcile the public exposure and financial collapse with the stable life she had expected. Their lakefront home had been sold to cover legal expenses and the settlement of civil claims. Former colleagues had distanced themselves, concerned that association with him might damage their own careers. Perhaps most painful was the estrangement from his daughter, Catherine Reynolds, a 24-year-old graduate student who had been horrified by her father's behavior as captured on the viral videos. Their relationship, once close, had deteriorated into tense occasional text messages and declined invitations for holiday visits. As Reynolds placed the rejection email in a folder containing dozens of similar messages, his phone chimed with a notification. It was an email from an unfamiliar address with the subject line, "Regarding Flight 447. Personal." His finger hovered over the delete button. He had received countless messages from strangers, most hostile or mocking, but something made him open this one. Captain Reynolds: "You don't know me, but I was a passenger in row 8 on Flight 447 6 months ago. I witnessed the entire interaction with Dr. Wilson and have thought about it frequently since then. I'm writing not to condemn you further. You've faced more consequences than most would in similar circumstances, but to share a perspective that might be meaningful as you move forward." What struck me most during the incident wasn't just the poor decisions regarding Dr. Wilson's seat, but the missed opportunity those decisions represented. You had the chance at multiple points to simply verify the booking timestamps and enforce the airline's own policy fairly. That would have been the end of it, a minor delay resolved according to established procedures. Instead, what we all witnessed was the gradual hardening of an initial mistake into an inflexible position, one that became increasingly difficult to reverse as more authority was invested in maintaining it. I've reflected on this pattern because I've recognized it in my own life and work the tendency to commit more deeply to a course of action, precisely because part of me recognizes it might be wrong. It's a common human failing, but one with particularly severe consequences for those in positions of authority. I don't know what your path forward looks like, but I believe that understanding why this happened beyond the superficial explanations of policy violations or bias might help you find meaning in an experience that has otherwise brought only loss. The most powerful learning often comes from our most painful mistakes. I hope that proves true for you. With respect for your humanity despite your errors, James Morales Reynolds read the message twice, then a third time. Unlike the hate mail he had received by the hundreds, this message contained neither absolution nor condemnation, only a thoughtful reflection on the human dynamics that had contributed to his catastrophic failure of judgment. The email prompted Reynolds to reach for a leather-bound journal he had begun keeping during the mandatory counseling sessions that had been part of his separation agreement with Monarch Air. In it, he had been working with varying degrees of honesty and insight to understand his own role in what had happened. Initial entries had focused on external factors, the pressure to maintain on-time departures, the unwritten expectations regarding elite passenger treatment, the lack of clear protocols for resolving seating disputes. Over time, and with the persistent guidance of his therapist, the reflections had gradually shifted toward his personal responsibility, the choices he had made at each critical juncture that had escalated rather than resolved the situation. Today, prompted by James Morales' email, he wrote about the moment when trainee flight attendant Lisa Kennedy had verified Dr. Wilson's earlier booking timestamp. He had dismissed this information not because it was irrelevant, but precisely because it challenged the decision he had already committed to. His authority, once invoked, had become more important to maintain than the facts of the situation. This pattern, the prioritization of authority over accuracy, of consistency over correction, had defined not just the Flight 447 incident, but much of his approach to command throughout his career. It had served him in some contexts, creating clear chains of decision-making in operational situations, but it had ultimately destroyed him when applied to a situation that required flexibility, humility, and the willingness to acknowledge an error. As Reynolds continued writing, his phone chimed again with an incoming text message from his daughter, Catherine. Dad, I've been thinking about our last conversation. I'm in Seattle next weekend for a conference. Maybe we could have coffee. No promises about fixing everything, but I'm willing to talk. It was the first such overture in months. A small opening, neither a reconciliation nor a continued rejection. Like James Morales' email, it offered neither absolution nor condemnation, but rather the possibility that understanding might eventually emerge from the wreckage of his former life. Reynolds typed a simple reply. I'd like that very much. Thank you for reaching out. Later that evening, as he prepared for bed in his quiet rental home, Reynolds noticed an envelope that had been slipped under his front door. It contained a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. Captain Reynolds, you won't remember me, but I was your first officer on a Denver-Seattle route about 5 years ago. I've followed the Flight 447 story and its aftermath, and while I can't defend the decisions you made that day, I also can't forget that you were the pilot who taught me the importance of double-checking weather reports even when dispatch said conditions were clear. Your caution during that approach likely saved lives. That matters too. If you're interested in exploring non-flying aviation roles, my brother's company is looking for a safety consultant with operational experience. It's not commanding a 787, but it might be a way to use what you've learned, all of it, including the hardest lessons, constructively. His card is enclosed if you want to follow up. Michael Bennett. Reynolds held the note for a long moment, unexpected tears blurring his vision. After months of unmitigated consequences, professional, financial, personal, this simple acknowledgement of his humanity, of the complexity that existed beyond the viral moment that had defined him, felt like the first breath after being underwater. The former captain had no illusions about his future. His days of flight deck command were over. His marriage was finished. His reputation would forever be linked to one catastrophic failure of judgment. The consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. But in these small moments, a thoughtful email from a former passenger, a tentative text from his daughter, a handwritten note from a colleague who remembered more than just his worst moment. There was the suggestion that consequences, however severe and deserved, were not the end of the story. There remained the possibility of understanding, of growth, perhaps even of contribution in a different form. Reynolds placed the safety consultant's business card on his bedside table. Tomorrow, he decided he would call. Not because he deserved a second chance, but because the hard-won insights from his failure might yet serve some purpose beyond his own reckoning. 1 year after the Flight 447 incident, industry leaders, regulatory officials, and consumer advocates gathered at the National Aviation Policy Conference in Washington, D.C. for a panel titled "The Wilson Standards Transforming Passenger Rights in Commercial Aviation." The large conference room was filled to capacity with attendees ranging from airline executives to civil rights attorneys to travel journalists. The panel moderator, respected transportation analyst Eleanor Park, opened the session with a striking statistical overview. In the 12 months since what's now commonly called the Wilson incident, we've seen a 73% reduction in formal discrimination complaints across major U.S. carriers. Passenger satisfaction scores regarding fair and equal treatment have increased by 28 percentage points. And perhaps most significantly, the transparency indexes we track regarding policy enforcement consistency have shown improvement across every major airline. These metrics quantified what industry insiders and frequent travelers had already recognized: a fundamental shift had occurred in how airlines approached passenger rights policy enforcement and equitable treatment. What had begun as a crisis for one airline had catalyzed an industry-wide revolution in practices, policies, and priorities. The most visible manifestation of this revolution was the formalization of the Wilson Standards, a set of principles originally developed as part of Monarch Air's settlement with Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, but subsequently adopted by airlines worldwide as both a practical framework and a marketing advantage. Atlantic Airways CEO Thomas Mitchell, speaking on the panel, explained the business case for embracing these standards. Initially, many airlines viewed this as primarily a reputation management issue. But what we've discovered is that consistent policy enforcement actually reduces operational costs by eliminating confusion, preventing escalations, and building passenger trust. Doing the right thing turns out to be good business. The core elements of the Wilson Standards had evolved from the original settlement terms to include transparent policy hierarchy, clear, publicly accessible documentation of how potentially conflicting priorities, booking time, loyalty status, accessibility needs would be weighted in operational decisions, consistent enforcement metrics, regular audits of policy application across demographic groups with results published publicly and incorporated into executive performance evaluations, accountability infrastructure. Independent passenger advocates empowered to intervene in real time when discrepancies in treatment were identified. Compensation, proportionality, standardized formulas for passenger compensation. When operational needs required, changes to confirmed arrangements designed to reflect the actual inconvenience experienced rather than the passenger's status or perceived value. Implicit bias training. Comprehensive evidence-based programs for all customer-facing staff focused on practical decision-making scenarios rather than theoretical concepts. The Federal Aviation Administration and Department of Transportation had reinforced these industry-led changes with enhanced regulatory oversight. Assistant Secretary for Aviation Consumer Protection, Daniela Rodriguez, Another panelist outlined the new regulatory framework. Following the recommendations of our Equity and Commercial Aviation Task Force, we've implemented mandatory reporting requirements for all involuntary passenger relocations with demographic data that allows us to identify potential patterns of discriminatory enforcement, Rodriguez explained. Airlines now know that selective policy application won't just risk viral incidents, but will trigger regulatory scrutiny. Technology had played a crucial role in this transformation as well. Most major carriers had implemented real-time tracking systems for seating assignments and changes accessible to passengers through mobile apps. These systems created digital audit trails for every decision, reducing the likelihood of arbitrary or biased enforcement. Transparency is the key element noted. Consumer advocate Jason Williams. When passengers can see exactly how and why decisions are made, and when airlines know those decisions are being documented, the incentives align toward consistent fairness rather than preferential treatment. The revolution extended beyond policies and technologies to fundamental questions of corporate culture and values. Airlines that had long prioritized high-spending business travelers and elite status members were recalibrating their approach, recognizing that perceived fairness influenced purchase decisions across all passenger segments. Independent oversight had emerged as another crucial component of the new landscape. The Wilson Foundation's Airline Accountability Index, which rated carriers on policy transparency, consistent enforcement, and equitable treatment, had quickly become an influential factor in both consumer choices and investor decisions. What makes this index particularly effective, explained Foundation Director Maya Johnson during the panel, is that it combines objective metrics like complaint rates and policy transparency with randomized testing, sending pairs of passengers with identical bookings but different demographic characteristics through the same processes and documenting any disparities in treatment. For Monarch Air specifically, the journey from crisis to transformation had been neither quick nor easy. The airline had experienced significant financial losses, leadership changes, and continued scrutiny. Yet under CEO Ramon Vasquez's direction, it had gradually repositioned itself as a leader in the equity-focused approach to customer service. We had the hardest lesson, so perhaps it's fitting that we've committed most deeply to the necessary changes, Vasquez noted during the panel discussion. The Wilson Standards aren't just a settlement obligation for us. They've become the foundation of our operational philosophy and our brand promise. Vasquez's leadership in this area had earned Monarch Air cautious praise from former critics, including civil rights organizations that had initially called for boycotts. While the airline's reputation had not fully recovered, its transparent approach to reform had begun rebuilding trust among both passengers and investors. As the panel concluded, moderator Eleanor Park posed a final question to the participants. A year ago, many dismissed the Flight 447 incident as an isolated case that would quickly fade from public consciousness. Why do you believe it instead became a catalyst for such comprehensive industry change? After thoughtful responses from other panelists, Daniela Rodriguez offered a perspective that resonated deeply with the audience. What made this incident different was the perfect alignment of documentation, dignity, and determination. The clear video evidence made denial impossible. Dr. Wilson's composed insistence on fair treatment made her an unimpeachable advocate, and her persistent focus on structural change, rather than personal compensation or publicity, created a pathway for meaningful reform. This analysis captured the essential alchemy that had transformed a first-class confrontation into an industry revolution, a rare moment when documentation, character, and circumstances combined to make visible what had long remained unseen and to make inevitable what had previously seemed impossible. As the conference attendees filed out of the session, many passed a simple plaque that had been installed in the convention center lobby bearing a quote from Dr. Gabrielle Wilson, "Equal treatment isn't an aspiration or a courtesy. It's the minimum standard for a just society." That principle, articulated by a medical researcher who had simply wanted to sit in her assigned seat, had become the foundation for an industry's transformation. The auditorium at Johns Hopkins Medical School fell silent as Dr. Gabrielle Wilson approached the podium. The prestigious Innovations in Medicine lecture series typically focused exclusively on scientific breakthroughs, but today's presentation had drawn an unusually diverse audience: medical researchers alongside aviation executives, civil rights attorneys next to corporate ethics officers, all gathered to hear from the woman whose scientific accomplishments and personal courage had influenced fields far beyond her specialization. "Thank you for that generous introduction," Gabrielle began, acknowledging the dean's extensive overview of her synthetic skin graft research and its impact on burn treatment globally. "Today, I'd like to discuss not only the technical aspects of our recent breakthroughs, but also the ethical frameworks that must guide how we implement them." This integration of scientific content with ethical reflection represented the evolution of Gabrielle's professional voice over the years since the Flight 447 incident. While her research had always been characterized by rigorous methodology and clinical precision, she now explicitly addressed the human dimensions of medical innovation, particularly how advancements in treatment could either reinforce or reduce existing inequities in healthcare access and outcomes. "Our team has achieved a 94% reduction in rejection rates and a 65% decrease in recovery time." She continued, displaying slides showing cellular integration between the synthetic graft material and human tissue. "But the most significant advancement may be the simplified application protocol that makes this treatment viable in settings without specialized burn units or extensive support infrastructure." This focus on accessibility rather than just efficacy reflected Gabrielle's deepening commitment to ensuring that medical innovations reached all patients who needed them, not just those in well-resourced settings. Her research team had dedicated substantial effort to adapting the technology for use in field hospitals, rural clinics, and developing regions where advanced burn care had previously been unavailable. The audience, which included representatives from global health organizations and humanitarian medical groups, responded with appreciative nods. Gabrielle had become known not only for her scientific brilliance, but for her insistence that medical innovation should serve the broadest possible patient population. As she transitioned to the ethical portion of her lecture, Gabrielle addressed the connection that many in the room were silently acknowledging between her stand for equal treatment on Flight 447 and her advocacy for equitable healthcare access. "Some of you may wonder why a presentation on synthetic skin grafts includes a section on ethics and equity," she noted with a small smile. "Others may be curious about the connection between my research work and the more public aspects of my past year. The truth is that both are expressions of the same fundamental principle that dignity is not a luxury good but a basic right." This framing dignity as a non-negotiable right rather than a conditional privilege had become central to Gabrielle's public voice since the incident. It provided a conceptual bridge between her scientific work and her unexpected role as a catalyst for institutional change. In medicine, as in other fields, we often make unconscious calculations about whose comfort, whose convenience, whose needs take priority. She continued. "These calculations can reflect our best clinical judgment, or they can reflect unexamined biases about whose pain matters most, whose time is most valuable, whose outcomes deserve our highest efforts." The audience's attention was palpable as Gabrielle connected her personal experience to broader patterns in healthcare delivery and medical research priorities. Without directly referencing the Flight 447 confrontation, she drew powerful parallels between the selective enforcement of airline policies and the disparities documented in pain management treatment access and clinical trial representation. "What I've come to understand more deeply this year is that standing firm for fairness isn't separate from my scientific work, it's essential to it," she explained. "The most brilliant medical innovation has limited value if it's deployed in ways that reinforce existing inequities rather than reducing them." This perspective had transformed not only Gabrielle's public presentations but the operations of her research laboratory and clinical trials. She had implemented new protocols for patient recruitment that ensured diverse representation across demographic groups. Her team had developed multilingual educational materials for patients and providers, and she had established fellowships specifically for researchers from underrepresented backgrounds, creating pathways for greater diversity within the field. Following her formal presentation, the question and answer session reflected the dual nature of the audience's interest. Scientific inquiries about graft techniques, alongside questions about how she had maintained her focus on research while navigating unexpected public attention. How did you balance the demands of your scientific work with the advocacy opportunities that emerged from the Flight 447 incident? Asked a young researcher from the audience. Gabrielle considered the question thoughtfully. I never viewed them as separate or competing priorities, she responded. My commitment to advancing burn treatment and my insistence on equal treatment in public spaces come from the same core values, the belief that everyone deserves dignity, that systems should serve people rather than the reverse, and that standing firm for these principles is worth temporary discomfort. This integration of personal experience with professional purpose had been central to Gabrielle's journey over the past year. Rather than compartmentalizing the Flight 447 incident as an unfortunate disruption to her scientific career, she had incorporated its lessons into her approach to research mentorship and institutional engagement. The impact of this integrated perspective extended beyond her immediate professional circle. Younger scientists, particularly women of color, had reached out to express how her example had influenced their own approaches to navigating academic medicine and research environments. Medical school ethics curricula had incorporated case studies based on her experiences, using them to explore questions of advocacy, professional identity, and institutional change. As the lecture concluded and Gabrielle accepted the extended standing ovation, she reflected briefly on the unexpected path of the past year. The Flight 447 confrontation had not been something she sought or welcomed. It had brought challenges, disruptions, and unwanted attention. Yet it had also created opportunities for influence and impact that might otherwise have been unavailable. More importantly, it had deepened her understanding of how individual actions, whether in a first-class cabin or a research laboratory, could catalyze institutional change when they exposed contradictions between stated values and actual practices, between policies on paper and policies in application. This understanding had transformed not only her public voice, but her sense of purpose and possibility. The synthetic skin graft technology remained her primary professional focus, with promising clinical trials continuing to demonstrate its potential to transform burn treatment worldwide. But alongside this scientific mission, she had embraced a broader role in advancing equity across multiple spheres: healthcare, transportation, public accommodation, and beyond. It wasn't a role she had anticipated or initially welcomed, but like the unexpected research findings that sometimes led to the most significant scientific breakthroughs, she had come to recognize its value and importance, not despite its deviation from her planned path, but because of the new perspectives it had revealed. Exactly 1 year after the Flight 447 confrontation, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson settled into Seat 3A on Monarch Air Flight 447 from JFK to LAX. The symmetry was intentional. She had specifically chosen this flight, this airline, and this seat as a personal milestone in a journey that had extended far beyond air travel. The Monarch Air terminal experience had been noticeably different from a year earlier. Check-in agents made consistent eye contact with all passengers regardless of their appearance or status. Boarding announcements emphasized the airline's commitment to consistent application of policies for all travelers. Digital displays highlighted the Wilson Protocol for resolving seating disputes with transparent criteria, prioritizing booking timestamp over status considerations. As Gabrielle boarded, she was greeted by a flight attendant whose nameplate identified her as Teresa Martinez, Service Equity Lead, one of the new positions created under the settlement agreement. Teresa's recognition was immediate but professional. "Dr. Wilson, welcome aboard. We're honored to have you with us today. she said, maintaining the same courteous tone she had used with previous passengers. Taking her seat, Gabrielle noted other changes implemented since her last Monarch Air flight. Each seatback displayed a QR code linking to the airline's transparent policy documentation and reporting system for perceived disparities in treatment. The safety video included a brief segment on the company's commitment to equal respect and consistent service for every passenger. The in-flight magazine featured an article on the Wilson Foundation's latest research on equitable practices in commercial services. As other passengers boarded, several recognized her, some from news coverage, others from her medical research publications, still others from her more recent speaking engagements on institutional change. Their reactions ranged from subtle nods of acknowledgement to discreet thumbs-up gestures to direct expressions of gratitude. "Your stand made a difference," whispered a middle-aged woman as she passed Gabrielle's seat. "My daughter wrote her college essay about watching that video and what it taught her about dignified resistance." A flight attendant approached with the traditional pre-departure beverage offering. "Dr. Wilson, would you prefer champagne water or orange juice?" "Water, please," Gabrielle replied with a smile. "And thank you for asking everyone the same question in the same way. I noticed that earlier. It's a small thing, but important." The flight attendant nodded, understanding the significance of this observation. "It's part of our standardized service protocol now. Everyone gets the same options presented the same way, regardless of status or appearance. It seems obvious in retrospect, but it actually required rewriting all our training materials." As the boarding process continued, Gabrielle reflected on the complex journey of the past year. The initial confrontation had led to the settlement agreement, which had catalyzed the Wilson Protocol, which had inspired similar reforms across the industry, which had ultimately resulted in the noticeably different experience she was having today on the same flight in the same seat 1 year later. The journey had not been without challenges. There had been backlash from those who viewed her stand as an overreaction or attention-seeking. There had been endless demands on her time from media outlets, conference organizers, and advocacy groups. There had been the delicate balance of maintaining focus on her scientific research while engaging with the broader implications of her experience. But sitting in seat 3A 1 year later, Gabrielle could see tangible evidence that standing firm in that moment had created ripples of positive change extending far beyond her individual experience. The difference wasn't just in policies on paper, but in observable behaviors, attitudes, and expectations. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Gabrielle opened her laptop to review the latest data from her lab's clinical trials. The synthetic skin graft technology continued to exceed expectations, with international implementation now advancing in partnership with several humanitarian medical organizations. This work, her life's primary purpose, had continued and even accelerated despite the unexpected detour of public attention. Midway through the flight, a passenger from across the aisle approached hesitantly. "Dr. Wilson, I'm sorry to interrupt your work, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Nathan Blackwell." Gabrielle looked up immediately, recognizing the significance of the name. "Related to Julia Blackwell, the former CEO," her son Nathan confirmed. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything last year. Many people would have sought personal vengeance or public humiliation, but you consistently focused on structural change rather than individual blame. That approach made it possible for the company to actually reform rather than just perform remorse. This unexpected encounter represented another dimension of the past year's journey, the recognition that meaningful change required focusing on systems rather than scapegoats, on patterns rather than personalities. Gabrielle had consistently emphasized this perspective in her public statements and settlement negotiations, understanding that lasting reform would require institutional transformation rather than merely punishing individuals. "Your mother faced an impossible situation that she inherited rather than created," Gabrielle acknowledged. "The problems revealed that day were institutional, not just individual. I've respected how she's advocated for industry-wide reforms, even after leaving Monarch Air. Nathan nodded gratefully. That's meant a lot to her. She's actually heading an aviation ethics initiative, now developing best practices for navigating conflicts between customer experience, operational efficiency, and equal treatment. As Nathan returned to his seat, Gabrielle noticed a young flight attendant watching their interaction with interest. It was Lisa Kennedy, the trainee, who had verified Gabrielle's booking priority during the original confrontation. Now, wearing the uniform insignia of a full flight attendant, Lisa approached during a quiet moment in the service routine. Dr. Wilson, I'm not sure if you remember me, but... Of course I remember you. Lisa. Gabrielle interrupted warmly. Your courage in verifying the facts that day was a crucial turning point. How has your journey been since then? Lisa's face brightened at the recognition. Challenging, but meaningful. After the initial suspension and reinstatement, I was offered a role helping develop the new training protocols. Now I'm splitting my time between regular flight duties and teaching the service equity module to new hires. That's the perfect role for someone who demonstrated such clear ethical judgment under pressure, Gabrielle observed. Lisa lowered her voice slightly. I still think about that day often, how close I came to staying silent and how much would have been lost if I had. It taught me that speaking truth in the moment, even when it's uncomfortable, can prevent so much greater harm later. This insight, the value of addressing contradictions when they first appear, rather than allowing them to escalate, resonated deeply with Gabrielle. Her own stand had embodied this principle, addressing the discrepancy between policy and practice directly and immediately, rather than accepting it for temporary convenience. As the flight began its descent into Los Angeles, Gabrielle closed her laptop and gazed out the window at the California coastline emerging through scattered clouds. The symmetry of this moment, same flight, same seat, 1 year later, provided natural closure to a chapter that had unexpectedly become part of her life's narrative. The experience hadn't changed her fundamental identity or purpose. She remained first and foremost a medical researcher committed to advancing burn treatment technology. But it had expanded her understanding of how that purpose connected to broader questions of equity, dignity, and institutional accountability. As the wheels touched down at LAX, Gabrielle felt a sense of completion rather than triumph. The goal had never been victory over Monarch Air or personal vindication. It had been the simple but profound principle that policies should be applied consistently, that dignity should be afforded equally, and that standing firm for these principles could catalyze meaningful change. In Seat 3A, 1 year later, the evidence of that change surrounded her not just in airline protocols and service standards, but in the hundreds of small interactions that collectively shaped the experience of occupying public space. The journey had come full circle, not to an ending, but to a new beginning, built on the foundation of lessons learned and principles affirmed. The Wilson Foundation headquarters in Baltimore hummed with activity as staff prepared for the annual scholarship announcement ceremony. In a quiet corner office overlooking the harbor, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson reviewed the final candidate profiles for the inaugural Emerging Scientists Program, a comprehensive initiative supporting undergraduate researchers from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in medical science and bioengineering. A soft knock at her door interrupted her concentration. Dr. Wilson Jasmine Williams has arrived for her interview, announced Maya Johnson, the Foundation's executive director. Wonderful, Gabrielle replied, standing to welcome the young woman who represented both the Foundation's mission and the full-circle moment of her own unexpected journey. Jasmine Williams entered with the slightly nervous energy of a talented student aware of the opportunity before her. At 19, she had already demonstrated extraordinary potential through her research on cellular regeneration at Howard University, where she was completing her sophomore year as a biomedical engineering major. It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Wilson Jasmine, said, extending her hand with a confident grip that balanced respect with self-assurance. Your work on synthetic skin grafts inspired my interest in regenerative medicine. The honor is mine, Gabrielle replied warmly, gesturing to the sitting area by the window. Your proposal on improved vascularization techniques shows remarkable insight for an undergraduate researcher. As they settled into their conversation, the parallels between them emerged naturally. Like Gabrielle, Jasmine had grown up in a working-class family with parents who emphasized education as the path to opportunity. Like Gabrielle, she had navigated predominantly white institutions with determination and dignity. And like Gabrielle, she possessed both scientific brilliance and a clear-eyed understanding of the structural barriers that remained in academic medicine and scientific research. What particularly impressed the selection committee, Gabrielle noted, was your integration of accessibility considerations into the design process. Most researchers address implementation challenges after developing the technology, but you've incorporated them from the beginning. Jasmine nodded her enthusiasm for the topic, overcoming initial nervousness. I believe medical innovations should be designed with all potential patients in mind from the start, not just those in well-resourced settings. My grandmother lost her leg to an infected wound because the rural clinic near her hometown lacked advanced treatment options. That experience shaped my perspective on what makes medical technology truly valuable. This integration of personal experience with scientific purpose resonated deeply with Gabrielle. Her own journey over the past year had reinforced the connection between individual dignity and institutional practices, between standing firm in one's rightful place and creating space for others to do the same. As their conversation progressed from scientific methodology to career aspirations, Jasmine hesitated briefly before asking a more personal question. Dr. Wilson, may I ask about something beyond my research proposal? Of course, Gabrielle replied. The incident on that flight last year, it affected me profoundly, Jasmine admitted. I was in my freshman year feeling constantly pressured to prove I belonged in advanced science courses. Watching you refuse to accept less than what you were entitled to with such calm dignity despite the pressure. It changed something for me. This was not the first such confession Gabrielle had heard. Over the past year, countless individuals, particularly young women of color in professional fields, had shared how the documented confrontation had influenced their own approaches to navigating spaces where their presence was questioned or their rights minimized. After seeing that video, Jasmine continued, I started speaking up more in class. I stopped accepting being interrupted or having my ideas attributed to others. I began insisting on proper acknowledgement of my contributions to group projects. Small things, maybe, but they felt revolutionary to me. Gabrielle recognized in this confession the most meaningful legacy of her stand, not the policy changes or corporate reforms, but the individual recalibrations of what was acceptable, what was possible, what was worth defending. Those aren't small things at all, she responded. They're the daily moments where we either reinforce or challenge the assumptions about who belongs where, whose voice matters, whose rights are automatically respected, and whose must be repeatedly defended. Jasmine nodded her expression, reflecting both vulnerability and determination. There was a specific moment last semester that I keep thinking about. My advanced biology professor consistently called on male students first and gave them more speaking time. After 3 classes, I stayed behind and showed him the data I'd collected on participation patterns. He was defensive initially, but eventually acknowledged the pattern and changed his approach. And how did that feel? Gabrielle asked, genuinely curious about the young woman's experience. Terrifying before powerful during and afterward. Just right, Jasmine replied with a small smile, like I'd shifted something important, not just for myself, but for others who might not have felt able to speak up. This description captured precisely what Gabrielle had experienced during and after the Flight 447 confrontation, the transformation of individual discomfort into collective benefit, of personal risk into structural change. As their interview concluded, Gabrielle shared the news that Jasmine had already guessed, but couldn't assume she had been selected as one of the first 5 Wilson Foundation emerging scientists receiving full academic funding research support. professional mentorship and placement in an industry-leading laboratory internship program. This isn't charity or lowered standards, Gabrielle emphasized as Jasmine's eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. This is recognition of extraordinary talent that might otherwise be overlooked or underutilized. The scholarship exists because systems don't always recognize value accurately or distribute opportunities equitably. After Jasmine departed, Gabrielle returned to her desk reflecting on the full-circle nature of this encounter. The young scientist represented both the purpose behind her original stand on Flight 447 and the purpose that had defined her career long before that incident: creating and protecting spaces where talent could flourish regardless of background, where dignity was afforded equally to all, where standing firm against arbitrary limitations could open possibilities for others. Looking out at the harbor where ships moved steadily toward distant horizons, Gabrielle thought about the unexpected journey of the past year. What had begun as a simple refusal to accept less than what she had rightfully purchased had evolved into something far more significant, a catalyst for examining and reforming practices that had long gone unquestioned, a demonstration of how individual dignity could translate into institutional accountability. The Wilson Foundation. The industry reforms, the ongoing legal and regulatory changes, all of these had emerged from that single moment of quiet, determined resistance. Not because she had sought attention or impact, but because she had simply refused to accept treatment that contradicted both stated policies and basic principles of fairness. As she turned back to her desk to continue reviewing candidate profiles, Gabrielle reflected on what she had told Jasmine during their conversation, words that encapsulated the essential lesson of her unexpected journey. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be moved from the space you have rightfully earned, not with anger or aggression, but with calm certainty that dignity is not negotiable. That single act of standing firm can create ripples that eventually change the shape of the shore. In that quiet office overlooking the harbor, with the promise of Jasmine Williams and the other scholarship recipients extending the impact of her work in directions she could not yet imagine, Dr. Gabrielle Wilson had indeed come full circle from defending her own rightful place to creating space for others to occupy theirs, from a single seat on a single flight to a movement that continued to expand beyond what anyone could have predicted. The journey had not been one she sought or anticipated, but it had revealed possibilities for change that might otherwise have remained invisible, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not dramatic confrontation, but simply standing still, holding one's ground and insisting that dignity is not a privilege for some but a right for all. This powerful story reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes come from ordinary moments of extraordinary courage. Dr. Gabrielle Wilson never intended to start a movement. She simply refused to accept less than what she was entitled to. Her dignity, composure, and unwavering determination created ripples that transformed not just one airline, but an entire industry. If you've ever witnessed or experienced similar treatment, know that your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable, and your willingness to stand firm, even when pressured to move, can catalyze change beyond what you might imagine. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that expose injustice and celebrate the power of principled resistance. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they too can hold their ground with grace and determination. Remember, sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't raising your voice. It's refusing to be moved from the space you've rightfully earned.